Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel also. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. The floorboard creaked beneath my foot as I froze mid-step. It wasn't the sound that halted me, but rather the subtle shift in air pressure, as if the house had just exhaled 3 weeks into renovating this century-old Victorian. And I still couldn't shake the sensation that the walls were watching me. Most old houses settle in grand, but this one seemed to respond to my presence with deliberate intention. Standing in the upstairs hallway, dust motes dancing in the late afternoon sunlight, streaming through warped windows, I felt it again. That unmistakable feeling of being observed. I purchased the Harmon house for a steal leap because it had stood vacant for nearly 2 decades. The previous owners had abandoned it, suddenly leaving behind furniture draped in yellowed sheets and personal belongings that no one had bothered to claim. The realtor had been suspiciously evasive about the circumstances, mumbling something about family disputes and hasty relocations. I didn't press the issue at 35, recently divorced and desperate for a fresh start. The property's troubled history seemed inconsequential compared to its potential. The renovation had been progressing steadily until I decided to replace the water-damaged ceiling in the second-floor hallway. As I pried away the rotted drywall, a rectangular outline emerged, edges darkened with age. My heart quickened as I cleared away more debris, revealing what was unmistakably a trapdoor, its ancient pull ring tarnished to a dull copper. County records had mentioned nothing about an attic space. According to the blueprints, there should have been nothing above this ceiling except roof joists and insulation. I stood motionless, ladder swaying slightly beneath me as dust filtered down from the newly revealed opening. Logic dictated that I call my contractor, but something more primal overrode that instinct. This discovery felt intensely personal, as if the house had chosen to reveal its secret to me. Alone, the pull ring seemed to beckon promising answers to questions I had even formulated. Yet my palm was slick with sweat as I grasped the cold metal and pulled the hinges, protested with a guttural groan that resonated through the empty hallway. Stale air rushed downward, carrying the musty scent of decades-old isolation. I pointed my flashlight upward, the beam cutting through darkness, thick as oil, revealing only rough, unwooden beams disappearing into blackness. The rational part of my brain screamed warnings as I ascended the ladder and hoisted myself through the opening. My contractor would later explain building codes, load-bearing walls, structural integrity, all the reasons I shouldn't have entered an undocumented space without proper inspection. But in that moment, rationality had abandoned me entirely, replaced by an irresistible compulsion to explore the attic, stretch the entire length of the house, much larger than I'd anticipated. My flashlight beam captured cobwebs so dense they resembled gauzy curtains, hanging from exposed rafters and enshrouding silhouettes of furniture and stacked boxes. The air felt gelatinous, resistant, as if the darkness itself possessed physical weight. Each step forward released clouds of dust that swirled in hypnotic patterns before settling again. The temperature dropped perceptibly with each foot I ventured inward. By the time I reached the first grouping of sheet-covered objects, my breath emerged invisible. Puff's October in New England wasn't exactly warm, but this unnatural cold penetrated my skin, settling in my marrow. I told myself it was simply the poor insulation, the natural chill of an unused space. The alternative explanation that something was absorbing the heat around me was too disquieting to entertain. I pulled back the first sheet, triggering an avalanche of dust that sent me into a coughing fit. Beneath the yellowed fabric sat a mahogany writing desk, its surface still bearing the impressions of letters written long ago. Beside it, a leather chair bore the ghostly indentation of its last occupant, as if someone had just risen after. Decades of sitting, the desk drawer slid open with surprising ease, revealing nothing but a bond-handled letter opener and several sheets of blank parchment. The cardboard boxes proved more intriguing. The first contained bound ledgers filled with meticulous handwriting, documenting daily activities from the 1920s. The second held photographs in tarnished frames, stern-faced men with handlebar mustaches and women in high-neck dresses, eyes holding secrets across the senti that separated us. The third box contained personal effects, pocket watches, cufflinks, hair combs, and a woman's hand mirror, with the reflective surface turned mysteriously to face the bottom of the box as I lifted the mirror. My thumb brushed. Its surface and the temperature plummeted so dramatically that I gasped. The cold burned my lungs like inhaled frost behind me. Something fell with a muffled thud. I whirled around, flashlight beam wobbling across the attic expanse until it illuminated a picture frame now lying face down on the dusty floorboards. I distinctly remembered seeing it upright on a trunk moments earlier, at least 15 feet from where it now lay. My mouth went desert dry as I approached the fallen object. Lifting it revealed a portrait of a middle-aged man with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to follow my movement, even within the frozen moment of photography. His thin lips curved in what might have been a smile on anyone else, but on his gaunt face resembled nothing so much as a predatory assessment. The sound registered a split second before the sensation, a whisper so faint it might have been the brush of cloth against wood, followed by the unmistakable touch of cold fingers against the back of my neck. I spun around, flashlight beams slightly and wildly through empty air. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force I feared they might crack. The whisper came again this time, directly beside my ear. Unintelligible syllables delivered in a voice that seemed composed of rustling paper and creaking wood. I fled, there's no dignity in admitting it, but primal fear overwhelmed any curiosity or courage I might have possessed. I scrambled through the darkness, tangling in cobwebs that clung to my face like desperate hands, tripping over unseen obstacles that seemed to materialize in my path. When I finally reached the trap door, I practically threw myself down the ladder, slamming the portal shut with such force that plaster dust rained from the ceiling. I spent that night in a hotel, telling myself I simply needed distance from the renovation, dust and debris, but sleep eluded me as my mind replayed those seconds in the attic. The whispers, the sensation of being touched, the unnatural UL cold. By morning, I'd constructed a rational narrative. Old houses had drafts. My imagination, fueled by exhaustion and stress, had manufactured the rest. I returned to the house determined to approach the situation logically. Daylight transformed the Harmon house into something almost innocent. Sunlight streaming through windows, dust motes dancing in golden beams. I avoided looking at the trap door as I continued renovations elsewhere, but its presence loomed in my peripheral awareness like a dark pupil tracking my movements. That night marked the beginning of the sounds, at first just subtle creaks and groans that I attributed to the house settling. Then footsteps deliberate and measured directly above my bedroom. I tracked their progress, ice forming in my veins as they moved from one end of the ceiling to the other, pausing occasionally as if listening for my reaction. I convinced myself it was raccoons or squirrels that had found their way inside. Ignoring the perfectly timed pauses whenever I shifted in bed or cleared my throat the following day, I contacted wildlife removal services who found no evidence of animal intrusion. The exterminator scrutinized the trapo with professional interest, commenting that such architectural features were common in houses of this era. When I hesitantly mentioned the footsteps, he attributed them to expansion and contraction of old wood. I almost believed him until he was leaving and paused on the porch, asking with careful neutrality whether I lived in the house alone. Something in his expression, a mixture of concern and relief that he wasn't staying, left me profoundly unsettled that night. The whispers returned, no longer confined to the attic. They emanated from heating vents from inside the walls, from the darkened corners of my bedroom. Sometimes they formed what sounded almost like words. Other times they were merely exhalation. The respiratory functions of the house itself. I lay rigid beneath my blankets, sweat-soaked despite the unnatural chill, as shadows in the corners grew more substantial, stretching across the ceiling in patterns that suggested limbs and twisted torsos. Morning brought clarity and shame at my childish fears. I spent the day installing new lighting fixtures, deliberately creating as much noise as possible. The house responded with silence, patient watching. Silence for 3 nights, this pattern continued. Whispers and footsteps after sunset. Rational explanations at dawn. I began keeping a journal, documenting times and locations of the phenomena, trying to establish patterns. Sleep deprivation clouded my thinking, transforming everyday objects into lurking threats in my peripheral vision. My hands trembled constantly. My appetite vanished when my contractor commented on my appearance, suggesting I looked haunted. I nearly laughed at the unintentional accuracy the breaking point came when I discovered the footprints I'd been studiously avoiding the attic. But upon hearing a tremendous crash from above, I had no choice but to investigate. Raising the trapdoor revealed darkness as before, but now the air carried a sharp electric scent like ozone before a storm. My flashlight beam caught something unexpected on the dusty floor. Footprints that were decidedly not human, wider than my own with unusual spacing between elongated toe. Impressions they traversed the floor in patterns suggesting erratic pacing. More disturbing were the areas where they simply stopped in the middle of the attic, as if whatever made them had either vanished or risen from the floor altogether. The crash noise had come from an overturned trunk, its contents now scattered across the floor. Among the spilled items lay a leather-bound journal, open to a yellowed page covered in frantic handwriting. I approached cautiously, directing my flashlight beam at the exposed text. The handwriting began neat and orderly, but deteriorated into jagged scrolls. By the bottom of the page, the content described experiments in dimensional permeability and thinning the veil between worlds. The writer referred repeatedly to an entity they had invited in, but could no longer control. My mouth went dry as I read the final, barely legible line. It wears my face when I sleep. The temperature plummeted so suddenly I could hear the wooden beams contracting around me. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into absolute darkness, broken only by the faint rectangle of the open trap door 20 feet away. Something rustled in the darkness behind me, something large shifting its weight from one foot to another. The electric scent intensified, burning my nostrils and making my eyes water. I moved toward the exit with measured steps, fighting the urge to run running. Triggered predatory instincts, this knowledge surfaced from some primal part of my brain. Behind me, floorboards creaked under significant weight. The sound of breathing, raspy, uneven, struggling to mimic human respiration patterns, filled the attic space. 5T from the trapdoor, my foot struck something soft yet resistant. Looking down, I saw a bundle of fabric clothing that hadn't been there during my ascent. My flashlight chose that moment to sputter back to life, illuminating what lay at my feet, a suit of clothes identical to what I was currently wearing, arranged as if occupied by an invisible body. The whisper came from directly beside my ear were me. I don't remember descending the ladder. My next clear memory is of standing in my driveway, car keys clutched so tightly in my hand that they left indentations in my palm. I spent 2 nights in a hotel before my shame at running outweighed my terror of returning. The house seemed almost welcoming when I returned, warm, quiet, still. The trapdoor remained closed, showing no evidence of my frantic escape for several days. Nothing unusual occurred. No whispers, no footsteps, no sudden cold spots. I began to wonder if stress and isolation had manufactured the entire experience. Then I found the journal on my nightstand, the same leather-bound volume from the attic that I had left behind in my panic. It lay open to a new page, the handwriting now a perfect match for my own. The entry was dated the previous night and detailed my activities during hours I had supposedly been asleep. The final line read, "The exchange is almost complete that night." I set up video cameras throughout the house, focusing particularly on the hallway beneath the trappo. I forced myself to remain awake, monitoring the feeds from my laptop. Nothing unusual appeared until 3:17 a.m. When the video disted Ed with static through the electronic snow, I could make out a figure standing in the hallway, a silhouette that approximated my height and build, but seemed somehow wrong in its proportions, as if something was wearing an ill-fitting human costume. The figure looked directly into the camera, and though its face remained obscured by static, I felt its recognition. It knew it was being observed and welcomed the audience. It raised one hand in a gesture that might have been a wave, might have been a beckoning. Then the feed cut entirely. Seconds later, the trap door opened with a sound like tearing fabric. Footsteps crossed the ceiling directly above me, my footsteps perfectly mimicking my gait. Something began descending the ladder with deliberate, unhurried movements. I sit now in my car outside the Harmon house, writing this account as dawn approaches. Through the windows, I can see a figure moving from room to room, a figure dressed in my clothes with my approximate build practicing movements that almost but don't quite replicate natural human motion. Occasionally it passes before windows, and though the distance is too great to make out details, I know with certainty that its face is not entirely mine yet, but soon will be. I've contacted a local historical society about the former occupants of the Harmon House, particularly focusing on the owner from the 1920s, a physicist named Martin Harmon who disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind all his possessions, the research. Librarian mentions something curious every few decades. Someone moves into the house only to abruptly abandon it. Months later, property records show the same pattern. New owners who never formally sell the property, but simply leave tonight. I'm returning to the house, not to live there. I've accepted that the Harmon House was never truly mine. To claim I'm going back because I need to understand what exists in that attic space, what was invited in decades ago, and has been waiting for suitable vessels ever since I've convinced myself that knowledge, even terrible knowledge, is preferable to ignorance. The sun is rising now. Through the windshield, I can see the figure standing at the upstairs window watching me. It raises its hand in that same ambiguous gesture, greeting or summoning. I can't be sure. What I do know is that it's wearing my face now. Almost perfectly, almost but not quite. And the imperfections in that replication might be my only advantage. The silence wasn't natural. That was my first thought as I stepped through the massive oak doors of St. Bartholomew's Monastery. Silence should be empty, void of sound. But this silence had weight. It pressed against my eardrums like the atmosphere had thickened, as if the air itself was reluctant to vibrate. My footsteps should have echoed across the stone floor of the entrance hall, yet they seemed muffled, absorbed by something unseen. I checked my watch at 3:17 p.m. The caretaker had given me until sundown, roughly 4 hours, to photograph and document the 12th century structure for my article on forgotten architectural marvels. Plenty of time. I thought I was wrong. I'm a practical man, rational, skeptical. James Harrison, freelance writer, specializing in historical architecture, with bylines in National Geographic and Architectural Digest. I've explored abandoned castles in Scotland, ancient temples in Cambodia, and underground cities in Turkey. Nothing fazed me until St. Bartholomew's. The monastery perched on the edge of a cliff in the Carpathian Mountains, accessible only by a narrow road that wound treacherously up the mountainside. Local villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, crossing themselves when I mentioned my intention to visit the elderly innkeeper, had warned me in broken English not to stay after dark. That some places remember too much, I'd smiled politely, accustomed to local superstition surrounding ancient sites. Now standing in that crushing silence, her words echoed in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. I set up my camera in the central chapel, a cavernous space with vayed ceilings that disappeared into shadow dust. Mows floated in the weak sunlight that filtered through stained glass windows depicting saints in various poses of ecstasy or agony. It was difficult to distinguish which the colors were muted, the lead between panes blackened with age. I focused my lens on an intricate rose window when I first noticed it. A subtle movement, like a ripple across the glass. I lowered the camera, squinting. Nothing, just ancient static glass. A trick of the light, I reasoned, and continued my work. The main chapel documented, I moved deeper into the monastery, following a corridor that led to what had once been the monks' living quarters. Small cells lined both sides, each identical, a narrow stone shelf that had served as a bed. A small window cut into the thick wall, a crude wooden crucifix I photographed, several noting the aesthetic simplicity in my digital recorder. The monks of St. Bartholomew's embraced extreme deprivation. I dictated my voice, sounding flat and lifeless in the oppressive air. These cells more closely resembled prison cells than living quarters. It was in the third cell that I first heard it, a sound so faint I initially thought it was the wind finding its way through some unseen crack. But there was no draft, no movement of air. I stood perfectly still, straining to listen. There, it was again a whispered chant, multiple voices intertwining in a language I couldn't identify. Not Latin, not Greek, not any European tongue. I recognized the syllables seemed to slither through the air consonants, catching on. Impossible angles, vowels stretched beyond human capacity. I stepped back into the hallway expecting the sound to fade. Instead, it followed, maintaining the same volume. Regardless of where I moved, I cleared my throat, a deliberate sound to combat the unnatural chanting. "Hello," I called out, immediately, feeling foolish. The monastery had been abandoned for centuries, and the caretaker remained in his cottage at the base of the mountain. My voice didn't echo as it should have. Instead, it seemed to be swallowed by the stones themselves. The chanting stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even more disturbing. I returned to my work with forced determination. Moving methodically through the monastery's east wing, my camera's shutter clicked loudly in the stillness. As I documented dormitories, the refectory, the scriptorium where monks had painstakingly illuminated manuscripts throughout it all now. Couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Every few minutes, I would turn, suddenly convinced I would catch someone or something in my peripheral vision. But there was never anything there, just ancient stone and dust by 4:45 p.m. I had reached the western transept, where large stained glass windows depicted scenes of martyrdom in graphic detail. As I photographed a particularly vivid depiction of Saint Sebastian, pierced with arrows, sweat began to trickle down my spine. Despite the persistent chill, the face of the saint seemed too real, the agony too present, and then unmistakably his glass eyes shifted to look directly at me. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. The rational part of my brain scrambled for explanations, a play of light and optical illusion caused by the centuries-old imperfections in the glass. But then the face beside Saint Sebastian moved too, turning slightly, glass lips parting in what might have been a smile or a grimace. I raised my camera with trembling hands and peered through the viewfinder, both dreading and needing to document what I was seeing. The viewfinder showed only normal, static stained glass. I lowered the camera. The faces moved again, tracking my movement. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My throat constricted, making each breath a conscious effort. I backed away from the window, refusing to turn my back on it. The chanting had resumed, louder, now rising and falling in patterns that seemed to match the subtle movements of the glass faces. The logical part of my mind, the part that had served me well in my career, that valued evidence and reason, began to fracture. I told myself I was experiencing some form of hallucination, perhaps triggered by carbon monoxide leaking from the ancient heating system or by mold spores in the damp air. The caretaker had mentioned the monastery had been closed to regular tours after several visitors reported feeling ill. Maybe there was a scientific explanation for what I was experiencing, but science couldn't explain what happened next. As I retreated from the western transept, the stone floor beneath my feet began to vibrate, subtle at first, like the hum of distant machinery, but rapidly intensifying until I could feel it in my teeth, in my bones. The vibration carried intent. There was no other way to describe it. Each tremor seemed to communicate something beyond words, beyond sound. My mind translated it as hunger, as awakening, as recognition. The monastery wasn't empty. It had never been empty. I abandoned all pretense of continuing my work and turned to retrace my steps to the entrance. The corridor stretched before me longer than I remembered, the shadows between the vaulted arches deeper. More liquid, my flashlight beams seemed to stop short, absorbed by darkness that shouldn't have been so complete in mid-afternoon. My walking became jogging, became running, my camera bag slapping against my side. The chanting grew louder, no longer attempting to disguise itself as wind or imagination. It followed me, surrounded me, emanated from the very walls. The stone beneath my feet felt less solid with each step, as if it might give way to something waiting beneath. Something that had been waiting for a very long time. I stumbled into the central chapel, gasping for breath, my skin slick with cold sweat. The stained glass windows that had been merely dusty and old when I arrived now pulsed with internal light. Every depicted face was turned toward me, glass eyes tracking my panicked movements across the chapel floor. The chanting reached a crescendo, and with it the vibration in the stones. The monastery wasn't just a building, it was an entity unto itself. Generations of monks had lived and died within these walls, their prayers, their devotions, their secret rituals, all absorbed by the ancient stones. But what God had they been praying to? What entity had they been communing with in this remote mountain sanctuary? I reached the massive oak doors that led to the outside world and pushed with all my strength. They didn't budge. I heaved against them again, shoulder aching with the effort, nothing locked or sealed by forces I couldn't comprehend. My breath came in ragged gasps as I spun around. Back pressed against the unyielding wood, the chapel was transforming. Before my eyes, the air wavered like heat over asphalt, distorting the architecture columns, stretched and twisted. The floor undulated subtly as if breathing, and from every shadowed corner, every darkened alcove, shapes began to emerge. Not quite human. Not entirely corporeal figures in monk's robes, but wrong, somehow. Too tall, too fluid in their movements. Their faces obscured within deep hoods, but occasionally catching the sickly light in ways that revealed features no human face should possess. My legs gave way, and I slid down the door to crouch on the floor. My heartbeat was a deafening thunder in my ears. My vision narrowing as panic threatened to overwhelm me. I fumbled for my phone. No signal, of course, my digital recorder. Then, some way to document what was happening, to leave evidence. If I didn't, I couldn't complete the thought. Couldn't allow myself to consider what might happen. If I didn't make it out, the nearest robed figure glided forward, its movement too smooth, as if it floated inches above the stone floor. From within its hood came that same chanting. But I could now discern individual words, though in no language I recognized. Yet somehow, horrifyingly, I began to understand they were inviting me, welcoming me, offering to show me what lay beyond the veil of ordinary perception. They had been waiting for someone who could see someone who could hear. The monastery had been calling to me long before I'd ever heard of it, drawing me to this remote location for purposes I wouldn't comprehend, as the figure reached toward me with what might have been a hand beneath its flowing sleeve. The entire building shuddered violently. Dust and small fragments of stone rained from the ceiling. The chanting faltered, the figure paused, hood turning as if listening to something beyond my perception, then abruptly it retreated. The other figures melted back into shadows. The vibration in the floor subsided to a dull hum. The faces in the stained glass windows slowly, reluctantly returned to their original positions behind me. I heard the click of the door lock disengaging. I didn't question my sudden reprieve. Clutching my camera bag, I scrambled to my feet and pulled the door open. Nearly falling into the late afternoon sunlight, I ran down the ancient stone steps, not stopping, until I reached my rental car parked in the small gravel lot. My hand shook so violently I could barely insert the key into the ignition as I sped down the treacherous mountain road. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The monastery stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its silhouette sharp and mundane, betraying nothing of what dwelled within its walls, but in the highest window of the bell tower. A window I hadn't noticed during my visit. A window that caught the last rays of sunlight like a gleaming eye. Something moved. I never wrote the article about St. Bartholomew's Monastery. My photographs, when I finally gathered the courage to review them days later, in the safety of my apartment, showed only empty rooms. Dusty windows, ordinary stone walls. No evidence of what I'd experienced remained except for one unexplainable image, a photograph of my own reflection in a darkened window. But behind me, barely perceptible, stood hooded figures, their faces smudged and distorted in the glass, sometimes in the lial space between wakefulness and sleep. I hear the chanting again, distant but distinct, and I know with bone-deep certainty that what happened at St. Bartholomew's wasn't a hallucination or temporary insanity. The monastery found something in me, some quality, some potential, and it wasn't finished with me. It's patient. It has existed for centuries. It can wait a little longer. And sometimes when I look into mirrors or catch my reflection in windows, I notice my eyes tracking my movements with a slight delay, as if something else is looking out through them. Something that's been with me since I fled down that mountain road. Something that followed me home. Something that's still waiting the first time I heard it. I convinced myself it was nothing. A house settling pipes, expanding normal sounds, magnified by the silence of 3 a.m. But by the third night of furniture, dragging across hardwood floors that should be empty, of doors slamming shut in rooms, No one had entered for years. I knew something was wrong with the other side of my duplex. Something that defied explanation, something that was trying to get my attention. I'd found the rental listing 2 months ago, half a duplex in a quiet suburban neighborhood, at a price that seemed too good to question. The property manager mentioned casually that the adjoining unit had been vacant for some time, but assured me the building was structurally sound. What he failed to mention was that the thin walls between us would become a membrane. Between worlds tonight, as I lie awake at 2:47 a.m., the footsteps begin again. They're distinctive, hollow, as if the floor beneath them isn't quite solid. They pace methodically overhead, directly mirroring the layout of my own bedroom. My heart pounds against my ribs, each beat a thunderclap in my ears. I've learned the pattern now. First the footsteps, then the dragging sound, then a door will slam somewhere in the vacant half. I mouth the countdown. 3, 2, 1 slam right on. Cue my hand trembles as I reach for the glass of water on my nightstand. The cold liquid does nothing to relieve the dryness in my throat. I've asked neighbors about the previous tenant, but they exchange glances and change the subject. No one will talk about it. The only straight answer I've gotten was from Mrs. Levinson across the street, who said the place had been empty since the incident, then promptly shut her door in my face yesterday. I confronted the property manager, Marshall, demanding to know if someone had access to the other unit. My voice cracked with a week of sleepless nights. He seemed genuinely confused, insisting that no one had entered that side in years. He even pulled up the security system logs on his tablet. No recorded entries, no motion detections, nothing as he scrolled through empty data. I noticed beads of sweat forming on his upper lip, despite the office's aggressive air conditioning look. He said finally, not meeting my eyes sometimes with these old buildings. Sound travels in strange ways, could be raccoons, could be the plumbing. But I promise you, there's nobody in there. I didn't believe him. Raccoons don't drag furniture, plumbing. Doesn't walk with purpose tonight. I've decided to end the mystery. The narrow hallway is cold against my bare feet as I move toward my front door. Flashlight clutched in my white-knuckled grip outside the neighborhood, sleeps under a moonless sky. The other entrance, identical to mine, but with peeling paint and a tarnished doorknob, stands like a dark mirror to my own. I hesitate, my breath forming small clouds in the night. My lock-picking skills are non-existent, so I opt for a more direct approach. The crowbar in my hand feels substantial grounding, with 3 sharp strikes. The ancient lock gives way with a groan that seems too loud for the sleeping. Street I freeze, waiting for lights to flip on, for concerned neighbors to investigate nothing. Just the wind through autumn leaves and my own ragged breathing. The door swings inward on protesting hinges. The smell hits me, first stale air and dust, but underneath something else, something like ozone. After a lightning strike, metallic and charged, my flashlight beam cuts through darkness, revealing an interior layout identical to my own unit, but stripped in decayed dust coats. Every surface sheets drape over sparse furniture. Like shrouds, cobwebs stretch across corners, undisturbed for what must be years. This place couldn't possibly be the source of the sounds I've been hearing. No one has walked these floors in ages yet. As I stand in the entryway, a floorboard creaks overhead, distinct, deliberate. My mouth goes dry, the hair on my arm stands at attention. I should leave, I should board up this door and call it a night instead. I find myself moving deeper inside, drawn forward by a compulsion I can't name. My flashlight beam trembles across walls where rectangular outlines show where pictures once hung in the kitchen. A single cabinet door hangs askew. The refrigerator stands open, its interior dark and long. Empty, the stairs protest under my weight as I ascend each step, producing a symphony of creaks that seems impossibly loud. In the silence, sweat trickles down my spine. Despite the chill at the top of the stairs, I pause, listening. A murmur comes from behind the door that in my unit would lead to the master bedroom. It's not quite a voice, more like the memory of sound. A whisper playing on repeat, just below the threshold of comprehension. My hand hovers over the doorknob, slick with sweat. I count to 3 before turning it, pushing the door open with agonizing slowness. The master bedroom is empty except for a bed frame, stripped of its mattress, and a dresser with missing drawers. My flashlight beam skitters across the room, revealing nothing that could explain the noises. Nothing that could produce the murmuring that I can still hear now, seeming to come from the walls themselves. Then my light catches something in the corner. Shards of reflective glass scattered beneath a large rectangular outline on the wall. A mirror broken, I approach cautiously, glass crunching beneath my shoes. Most pieces lie directly below, but one shard remains in the frame, angled in such a way that it reflects a portion of the room behind me, and in that reflection stands a man. My body goes rigid, heart-stopping, before restarting at triple speed. He's tall, gaunt, dressed in clothes that might have been fashionable decades ago. His face is obscured by shadow, but his posture suggests he's watching me intently. I whirl around, flashlight beam slashing through empty air. There's no one there. No one at all when I turn back to the mirror shard. He's still there, motionless, watching. A scream builds in my throat, but emerges as a strangled whimper. The fragment doesn't reflect me, only him in a version of the room that looks cleaner, newer, inhabited. I back away until I hit the opposite wall. My breath coming in short, insufficient gas. The mirror fragment has fallen face down, and I don't dare approach to right it. I flee down the stairs, nearly falling in my haste. At the bottom, I collapse against the wall. Drawing deep, shuddering breaths, my rational mind scrambles for explanations. A trick of the light, an hallucination born of sleep deprivation. Anything but accepting what I just saw. That's when I notice it. The furniture in this living room has shifted position since I entered. The sheet-covered couch now sits at an angle as though recently dragged. One of the sheets has partially slipped, revealing upholstery that doesn't match the 1970s aesthetic of the house. It looks modern new, like my own furniture understanding, crashes over me like ice water. The layout isn't just similar, it's identical because it's a reflection. The vacant side doesn't mirror my unit. It reflects it like that mirror fragment upstairs, but reflections aren't supposed to move independently of their source. They aren't supposed to drag furniture in the middle of the night over the following days. I researched the property's history obsessively. The local library yields nothing unusual. The duplex was built in 1973, changed hands several times. I find no record of deaths or tragedies, nothing to explain a haunting my nights are spent. Sleepless, listening to the movements on the other side, trying to discern patterns. One name keeps appearing in the property records. Richard Keller, who owned both units from 1988 to 2017, when ownership transferred to the current management company. Finding Keller proves difficult. He seems to have vanished after selling the property. Social media yields nothing. It's as if the man ceased to exist the moment he signed over the deed. A week after my initial break-in, I returned to the vacant unit. I've convinced myself that daylight will reveal a rational explanation. Something I missed in my panicked midnight exploration. The broken lock has been replaced, the management company's work no doubt, but I've come prepared this time. The new lock yields to my amateur picking attempt after several frustrating minutes inside dust modes, dance in sunbeams that struggle through grimy windows. The place looks different in daylight, less menacing, more pathetic. I climb the stairs with more confidence than before. Though my heart still races with each step, the master bedroom door stands ajar, just as I left it. The broken mirror fragments remain scattered on the floor, but something's changed. The largest shard, the one that showed the reflection, has been moved. It now stands propped against the wall, angled to catch the light from the window. I approach cautiously, staying out of its reflective path. From an angle, I can see what it shows: my own unit, my own bedroom, but occupied. The man sits on the edge of my bed, head in his hands. This time, I can see his face. My face, but wrong, older, more haggard. With eyes that have seen too much, something in my mind recoils, refusing to process what I'm seeing. I back away, but my foot catches on a floorboard that gives way with a crack. I stumble, and in regaining my balance, pass directly in front of the mirror. Shard, our eyes meet mine, and not mine. And recognition flares in his gaze. He stands suddenly, mouth opening, as if to speak. The mirror fragment wobbles, then falls flat with a crash that seems to echo beyond what such a small piece of glass should produce. I run again, but the questions follow me home that night. The noises take on new significance. The footsteps match my own pacing, the furniture drag mirrors my nervous rearranging of my living room. Each sound from the other side now feels like an attempt at communication, rather than a haunting. I find myself talking to the walls, asking questions that vanish into the plaster. Sometimes I imagine responses in the ling of the house, in the ticking of pipes, in the whisper of air. Through vents on what would be my last night in the duplex, I finally locate Richard Keller. Not through research, but through memory. As I stare at my own reflection in my bathroom mirror, I notice a resemblance I should have seen immediately. The shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes, subtle but unmistakable once noticed. The truth assaults me in fragments like the broken mirror upstairs. My father's evasiveness about his past, my inexplicable attraction to this specific property. When house hunting, the familiar feeling I had upon moving in, as though I'd returned to somewhere I'd always known I'd never met my grandfather. Richard Keller, he abandoned my father as a child, disappeared into obscurity. The duplex must have been his final residence that night. I sit cross-legged on my bedroom floor, a handheld mirror propped before me. "Who are you?" I ask the empty air. "What do you want from me?" The house creaks in response, not from the other side, but all around me. The mirror before me fogs, though there's no moisture. Sourced nearby with trembling fingers, I reach out to touch its surface. It ripples like water. I jerk back, heart hammering against my ribs. The mirror solidifies again, but now shows a reflection that isn't mine to man. My doppelganger, my grandfather myself from another time, stares back at me from a room identical to mine, but subtly wrong. He raises his hand in exact mimicry of my startled position. Then he smiles. His lips move, forming words I can't hear. I lean closer, straining to understand we're all reflections. I think he says trapped on the wrong side. The mirror cracks down the center with a sound like ice breaking on a frozen lake. I scramble backward as the fragments scatter across my floor, reflecting nothing but my own terrified face. I understand now what haunts the other side of my duplex. Not a ghost, not a specter, but a fragment of reality caught in the wrong reflection. Perhaps my grandfather discovered something in this house, some thin place between worlds. Perhaps he tried to cross over and became trapped between states of existence, neither fully here nor fully there. Or perhaps I'm losing my mind, creating elaborate fantasies to explain ordinary house noises and strange coincidences. I've given notice to the property manager. I'll be out by the end of the month. But as I pack my belongings, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, not from the vacant unit next door, but from within my own rooms, from behind every reflective surface. Sometimes from the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of movement in mirrors and window, in the glossy surface of my phone screen. And sometimes, very faintly, I hear my own voice calling from somewhere I can't reach, asking questions I don't know how to answer. I've stopped looking in mirrors, I've covered every reflective surface in my unit, but I know it doesn't matter whatever connection has formed between me and the other side. It isn't confined to glass and silver. It's in the walls now, in the foundation, in the space between heartbeats. I'm leaving this place, but I'm no longer certain I'll be going alone, or that the person walking away will truly be me, and not some reflection that has learned to move on its own. The first time I heard my name whispered through the ancient rafters, I convinced myself it was just the wind. Old buildings speak in their own language, creaking, timbers settling foundations, the soft sigh of air through forgotten crevices. But St. Augustine's Cathedral spoke with unusual clarity, and as the weeks passed, I became increasingly certain that something within its walls knew exactly who I was. I've restored historic churches across 3 continents, but none had affected me like this one. From the moment I first stepped through its massive oak doors, something felt fundamental. Al wrong, the air inside hung heavy and stagnant, carrying a metallic tang that coated the back of my throat. Winter sunlight struggled through stained glass windows, casting sickly colored patterns that seemed to writhe across the stone floor. Even in broad daylight, shadows pulled unnaturally in corners. Where no shadows should exist, the parish had hired me to restore the cathedral to its former glory. The structure dated back to the 15th century, a magnificent recent example of Gothic architecture. Now marred by centuries of neglect, dark water stains streaked down walls. Once brilliant, Fresco had faded to ghostly impressions, and thick layers of soot obscured intricate stone carvings. The job would take months, perhaps even a year. But the challenge excited me, at least it did at first. My unease began with subtle disturbances. Tools I'd carefully arranged would be scattered by morning laters, shifted positions overnight. Strange drafts extinguished candles, even when no windows were open. I dismissed these occurrences as normal quirks of working in an ancient building until I began documenting the altars. Photography was part of my standard procedure, capturing every detail before restoration began. As I reviewed the images, my stomach tightened into a cold knot. Hidden beneath centuries of grime were symbols I recognized from no Christian tradition. Inverted spirals, angular rooms, and figures with too many limbs. I enhanced the photos, certain I was misinterpreting, but the clarity only confirmed my suspicions. These weren't decorative elements, they were deliberate inscriptions, carefully incorporated into the traditional Christian iconography, like a virus hidden within a healthy cell. I approached Father Daniels, the elderly priest who oversaw the parish, without directly mentioning the symbols. I asked about the church's history. His Ed face remained carefully neutral as he explained the cathedral had gone through difficult periods when certain clergy had strayed from Orthodox practices. His evasiveness only deepened my concerns. But I needed this job and convinced myself that historical oddities weren't unusual in buildings. This old, then the bell began to toll at midnight. The first night it happened, I bolted upright in bed, my thin mattress in the caretaker's quarters drenched with sweat. The sound vibrated through my chest, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to echo far longer than physics should allow. I fumbled for my phone. 12 a.m. Exactly racing to the window, I stared up at the bell tower expecting to see movement, but it stood perfectly still against the moonlit sky. The sound continued for exactly 12 rings before plunging the night into a silence that felt even more oppressive than the tolling. When I mentioned it to Father Daniels the next morning, his face drained of color. His hands trembled slightly as he informed me that the bell mechanism had been disabled decades ago after a structural assessment deemed the tower unsafe. Nobody had rung that bell in over 40 years. That afternoon, I found my first artifact while examining the choir loft, a leather-bound journal wedged behind a loose panel, its pages brittle and yellow with age. Most entries were mundane, church records, but scattered throughout were passages written in a different hand. The ink, a rusty brown that made my skin crawl. The writer described the voices from above in communion with those beyond the veil. Several pages contain the same symbols I'd photographed on the altars. The final entry, dated October 13th, 1887, simply read, "Brother Thomas has sealed himself in the attic. May God forgive what we have allowed. My rational mind urged me to dismiss the journal as the ravings of a disturbed monk. But something deeper in instinct I couldn't ignore told me I was brushing against the edges of something terrible that night." The bell tolled again, and as I lay rigid in my bed, I heard something new beneath its resonance, my name whispered with unmistakable clarity, as if spoken directly into my ear. Sleep became my enemy each night, brought new sounds scratching within the walls, footsteps in empty corridors, and always the whispers growing more consistent during daylight hours. Exhaustion clouded my judgment, and several times I nearly injured myself on scaffolding. My hands developed a persistent tremor, dark circles carved themselves beneath my eyes. I began to wonder if I was experiencing some form of auditory hallucination, perhaps triggered by mold spores or chemical exposure from the restoration materials, to prove to myself that my mind remained sound. I set up recording equipment throughout the cathedral. The next morning, I reviewed the footage with trembling hands. Most recordings captured nothing unusual until I reached the one position nearest the sealed attic door. The audio crackled with static for hours until precisely midnight, when the bell began to toll between each resonant strike. Came a whisper, distorted but unmistakable. My name repeated 12 times, followed by 3 words that sent ice water coursing through my veins. "Come find me," I confronted Father Daniels, no longer caring if he thought me unstable. Cornering him in his office, I demanded to know about Brother Thomas in the sealed attic. The color drained from his face as his eyes darted to the crucifix on his wall. as if seeking protection. After several moments of heavy silence, he reluctantly shared what the deceased had tried to suppress. For generations, Brother Thomas had been a brilliant scholar. With dangerous interests, he explained, in the late 1800s. While researching ancient texts in the cathedral's library, Thomas had discovered writings that predated the church documents describing rituals that supposedly thinned the boundary between worlds. Obsessed, he'd begun incorporating these practices into his devotions, eventually retreating to the attic where he conducted increasingly disturbing experiments. Strange phenomena plagued the cathedral, disembodied voices, objects moving on their own parishioners, reporting visions that drove several to madness. When church authorities finally intervened, they found the attic transformed into something that, as Father Daniels delicately phrased it, no longer belonged to our world. They sealed Brother Thomas inside, reinforcing the door with blessed iron and inscribing protective symbols across its surface. Whether he died there or escaped through some other means, no one knew for certain. The official records claimed he fled to another abbey, but the whispers about St. Augustine's never ceased. Father Daniels gripped my arm, his fingers surprisingly strong. For such an elderly man, he implored me to leave the attic, sealed to complete my work and depart as quickly as possible. The church needed restoration, he admitted, but some spaces were better left untouched. I nodded, promising to focus on the main cathedral spaces, but the recording had awakened something within me. A compulsion, I couldn't ignore that. Night long after Father Daniels had retired to his residence, I returned to the cathedral with a crowbar concealed in my tool bag. The attic door was located at the top of a narrow spiral staircase in the north transept. Decades of paint had sealed its edges, and symbols carved into its frame flickered strangely in the beam of my flashlight. My heart hammered against my ribs as I worked the crowbar into the seam. Sweat drenched my shirt despite the winter chill. Each crack and splinter of wood echoed through the empty cathedral, like gunshots when the door finally gave way. A blast of stale air rushed out, carrying a smell I can only describe as ancient. Not the familiar mustiness of old buildings, but something primordial like soil. From the deepest excavations, my flashlight beam seemed to penetrate only a few feet into the darkness, as if the attic absorbed light itself. I should have turned back every instinct. Screamed for retreat, but the whispers started again, pulling me forward with my name sounding almost joyful. Now my legs moved of their own accord as I stepped across the threshold. The attic stretched far larger than the cathedral's dimensions should have allowed. My flashlight revealed glimpses of strange geometries. Corners that bent at impossible angles. Walls that seemed to pulse with slow, deliberate movement. Symbols covered every surface, more intricate and numerous than those below, forming patterns that hurt my eyes. If I looked too long, in the center stood a crude altar. Not stone like those in the cathedral proper, but assembled from what appeared to be human bones, yellowed with age and bound together with blackened copper wire. Atop it sat a single object, a bell no larger than my palm, its surface etched with the same symbols that adorned the walls. The whispering grew louder, emanating not from any specific direction, but seemingly from the air itself. My name repeated in a rhythm that matched my racing pulse. The small bell began to vibrate, although nothing touched it. The flashlight flickered, its beam weakening as cold sweat soaked through my clothes. My mouth went desert dry and nausea rolled through my stomach. Then I saw a figure in the furthest corner, partially obscured by shadows. It wore what might once have been a monk's habit, now reduced to tattered rags. Its face remained hidden, but I could make out hands with fingers too long and too numerous, curved like talons. It didn't move toward me, but somehow I sensed it smiling. Pure terror paralyzed me. My muscles locked. My lungs seized, and for several eternal seconds I couldn't even blink. When the figure finally spoke, its voice matched the whispers exactly, but now carried a quality that vibrated in my bones. "You heard me," it said. Not moving from its corner after so long, "You heard me, the others ignored my call." I managed to force words through my constricted throat, asking what it wanted from me. The figure tilted what should have been its head. Freedom, companionship. Perhaps I merely wished to share what I've learned. It gestured toward the walls with one distorted hand. I've had much time to study the symbols. Speak true if you have patience to listen against my will. I found my eyes drawn to the patterns on the walls they seemed awry, now rearranging themselves into configurations that almost made sense. Nausea gave way to fascination as I began to perceive meaning in their arrangement. Glimpses of concepts just beyond comprehension. Knowledge hovering at the edge of my understanding, they called it heresy. The figure continued, but I merely sought what lies. Beyond the veil, there are spaces between worlds' passages that have always existed. I found one, or perhaps it found me. Its words resonated with an awful logic. I felt something shift in my perception, as if reality itself had become thin and malleable. The attic seemed to expand further, its boundaries blurring the air, thickened, pressing against my skin in like invisible hands. Then the church bell began to toll, though midnight had long passed. Each resonant strike sent vibrations through the attic, disrupting the symbol's hypnotic patterns. The figure recoiled, its form flickering like a bad television signal. I blinked rapidly, the spell broken, and suddenly recognized the danger with crystal clarity. I backed toward the door, maintaining eye contact with the shadowed figure. It made no move to stop me, but the disappointment in its voice cut through the tolling bell. They always leave, but I remained, and now you've opened the door. Those words chased me down the spiral staircase. I slammed the attic door shut behind me, wedging my crowbar through its handle and against the stone wall. Fumbling with shaking hands, I managed to take a photograph of the door's protective symbols before fleeing the cathedral entirely. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, lungs burning and legs trembling as I gripped the steering wheel trying to control my ragged breathing. A terrible realization dawned. The thing in the attic was right. I had opened the door that was 3 weeks ago. I broke my contract with the Daces, citing a family emergency fire. Daniels didn't question my sudden departure. Perhaps he recognized the haunted look in my eyes. I've since consulted experts in religious history, showing them my photographs of the symbol without revealing their source. Their reactions ranged from academic curiosity to outright fear, with one elderly professor refusing to discuss them at all. I've sealed the photographs and journal in a safety deposit box and moved to another state. But distance provides little comfort, sometimes in the liminal space between wakefulness and sleep. I hear whispers calling my name, and every night at midnight, no matter where I am, I feel the vibration of a toe and bell. Not in my ears, but deep in my chest, as if it rings within me. I've come to understand what happened at St. Augustine. Brother Thomas didn't discover ancient rituals, he became one. The thing in the attic wasn't trapped, it was waiting, and in my arrogance and curiosity, I provided exactly what it needed, an open door and a willing ear. I don't know if it can follow me, or if its influence is limited to the cathedral. But I understand now why Father Daniels looked so haunted when he spoke of the attic. It wasn't fear of what remained sealed inside, it was the terrible knowledge that some doors once opened can never truly be closed again. The moment I stepped through the ornate double doors of the Echo Harbor Hotel, I knew something was wrong, not with the structure. I'd assessed dozens of abandoned buildings in my 15 years as a restoration architect, but with the air itself, it hung heavy, as if the decades of vacancy had compressed rather than dissipated the atmosphere. The faded crimson carpets seemed to absorb the beam of my flashlight, creating a tunnel of burgundy stretching before me that appeared simultaneously inviting and threatening. My footsteps made no sound as I ventured inside. Despite the layer of dust that should have crunched beneath my boots, I've always prided myself on my rationality, the ability to see potential where others see only. Decay is what made me successful in my field. But rationality requires predictability, and the Echo Harbor Hotel defied all architectural logic. From the first moment, the assessment should have been routine. The City Council had finally approved the renovation budget for the historical landmark that had been abandoned since 1978. My job was to document structural integrity, create a preservation plan, and determine what could be salvaged. A 2-day job, 3 at most. I consulted my floor plans as I moved through the grand lobby. The massive chandelier above, draped in cobwebs, still retained hints of its crystal brilliance. My watch read 9:17 a.m., giving me plenty of daylight to work with, though the boarded windows allowed only thin slivers of morning light to penetrate the gloom. The first anomaly appeared as I approached the East Wing corridor. According to my blueprints, it should have extended roughly 60 feet before branching into the first floor guest rooms. But as I walked, the corridor seemed to stretch before me, the end receding further. With each step, I blinked hard, attributing the illusion to the monotonous pattern of the carpet and the poor lighting. After what felt like several minutes of walking, I stopped. A cold sweat had broken out across my forehead. Despite the chill in the air, I'd walked well over 100 feet, and the corridor showed no signs of ending. I turned back, determined to reorient myself with the lobby. 15 steps later, I found myself standing before an elevator bank I hadn't passed before. My heart rate quickened as I consulted the blueprints again. The elevator should have been in the central atrium, not the east wing. I moved closer, noticing the brass indicator above showed the elevator car was approaching this floor. The needle moved smoothly upward, stopping with a soft ding that echoed through the empty hallway. I took several steps backward, my rational mind searching for explanations. Perhaps there was a second bank of elevators not included in my outdated plans. Perhaps I'd misread my position. The doors remained closed, but from behind them came the unmistakable sound of conversation. The murmur of voices, the clink of glasses, faint laughter. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding flat and muffled, as if the air itself was dampening it. Building inspector on site, the voices continued, oblivious to my call. I reached toward the elevator call button, then hesitated, my fingers an inch from the tarnished brass. A rush of inexplicable dread stopped me. Instead, I turned and walked briskly back the way I'd come, or at least where I thought I'd come from. The corridor branched into 3 separate hallways, all identical, all with the same faded crimson runner, the same gilded sconces on the walls, the same numbered room doors stretching into the distance. I checked my phone to pull up the digital blueprints, but the screen showed no service, and the battery had mysteriously drained to 15%. Despite having been fully charged when I arrived, I chose the leftmost corridor, maintaining my professional composure. Even as my mind began cataloging the impossibilities accumulating around me, my watch now read 10:45 a.m. Though it felt as if I'd only been inside for 30 minutes at most. As I walked, the temperature fluctuated. Noticeably, patches of hallway were freezing cold, while others held pockets of warmth that smelled of cigar smoke and perfume. I passed a room with its door slightly ajar. Room 237. From inside came the sound of big band music and the clattering of dishes. I pushed the door wider with my clipboard. The room was empty, coated in dust, the furniture covered in yellowed sheets. The music stopped abruptly. My heart hammered against my ribs as I backed into the hallway. The rational explanations I'd been formulating began to disintegrate. Sound didn't. Travel like this in abandoned buildings' corridors didn't extend indefinitely. Time didn't slip away unnoticed. I abandoned my original assessment plan and decided to find the exit. I picked up my pace, following the emergency exit signs that would logically lead back to the main stairwell. Each sign pointed me deeper into the building, and soon I found myself climbing a staircase I didn't remember descending. I emerged onto what should have been the second floor, but the decor had changed completely. Gone were the faded crimson carpets, replaced by geometric art deco patterns in blue and gold. The lighting fixtures were different, the ceiling height lower. I checked the blueprints again, discovering with growing alarm that this section matched the hotel's original 1920s design before the major renovation in 1952. My mouth went dry. The temperature around me plummeted until I could see my breath-forming clouds in the air down the hallway. A door slammed shut, then another and another, like a cascading wave moving toward me. I ran, no longer concerned with maintaining professional detachment. My lungs burned as I sprinted. Down the impossible hallway, past doors that rattled in their frames as I passed, I skidded around a corner and froze. A massive ballroom opened before me, its space impossibly large for the building's footprint. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling painted with Renaissance-style frescoes. The parquet floor gleamed as if freshly polished across the vast empty space. A single figure stood with their back to me, dressed in what appeared to be a hotel staff uniform from the 1970s. "Excuse me." I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "I need to find the exit." The figure didn't move. but the sound of a bustling party suddenly filled the room. Laughter music, the clink of glasses, all without a single visible person. The cacophony grew louder until it was nearly deafening, then cut to absolute silence in an instant. When I looked again, the figure was gone. My professional training battled with primal fear. I forced myself to breathe deeply to analyze the situation. Logically, old buildings often had acoustic anomalies. The stress of working alone combined with the historical ambiance could trigger auditory parolia. The disorientation could be caused by poor air quality, perhaps mold spores or asbestos, but none of those explanations accounted for finding myself on a floor I hadn't climbed to or corridors that defied physical dimensions. I decided to follow the perimeter of the building, reasoning that eventually I would find an external wall with windows or an emergency exit. As I implemented this plan, I noticed that my watch now read 3:38 p.m., though no significant light change was visible through the few uncovered windows I passed. After what seemed like hours of walking, I stumbled upon a service area, a small break room, with a bulletin board covered in yellow notices. The most recent date I could find was October 17, 1978. Next to the time clock hung a black and white staff photograph. I leaned closer, studying the solemn faces of bellhop's maids and management. My blood turned to ice water in my veins in the back row. Partially obscured, but unmistakable, was my own face. I staggered backward, my clipboard clattering to the floor. That was impossible. I wasn't born until 1985, yet there I stood in a staff photo dated 7 years before my birth, wearing the uniform of a hotel manager. My expression blank, and my eyes somehow wrong too dark, too empty. A wave of nausea hit me as the room began to spin. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like a giant lung. The floor beneath me softened the linoleum, rippling like water. I grabbed the door frame to steady myself. My knuckles white with the effort. "It recognizes you now," came a voice from behind me. I whirled around to find an elderly maintenance man standing in the corridor, his weathered face impassive. As he leaned on a mop, I hadn't heard him approach, and his sudden presence sent another jolt of adrenaline through my system. He gestured vaguely at the walls around us. The hotel, he clarified, though I hadn't asked it, pulls back those who belong to it. I wanted to dismiss him as a hallucination, but the solid presence of another human being, the first real person I'd encountered, anchored me momentarily to reality. I asked him where the exit was, trying to keep the desperation from my voice. The old man shook his head slowly, informing me that exits were relative in the Echo Harbor. Some people found them easily, others never did. He suggested that perhaps I wasn't meant to leave yet, that the hotel had business with me. Before I could question him further, a door slammed somewhere nearby, and the maintenance man's attention snapped toward the sound. He gave me one last significant look before shuffling away his form, seeming to dissolve into the shadows of the hallway. I stood frozen for several moments, then collected my clipboard with trembling hands. The photograph on the bulletin board had changed. The figure that had worn my face was now blurred, as if someone had smudged it, deliberately determined to escape. I chose a direction and walked purposefully, ignoring the whispers that seemed to follow me, and the shadows that darted just at the edge of my peripheral vision. The corridors began to spiral inward, leading me to what I believed was the central core of the building. Instead, I found myself in what appeared to be a hotel room, a pristine suite that looked recently occupied. A typewriter sat on the desk, a half-finished page still rolled into the carriage. The bed was rumpled, a coffee cup on the nightstand, still half full. On the desk lay a leather-bound journal open to a page filled with handwritten notes against every instinct screaming at me to leave. I approached the desk and looked down at the journal. The handwriting was mine. The notes detailed architectural observations about the Echo Harbor, hotel structural assessments, preservation recommendations, restoration priorities, all written in my distinctive script, but I hadn't written any of it. The last entry stopped mid-sentence. The corridor seemed to reconfigure when unobserved, suggesting that the building's footprint is not constrained by normal physical. My hand shook so badly I could barely turn the page. The next sheet was blank except for a single line at the top. Day 824 of assessment. I backed away from the desk, bumping into a full-length mirror I hadn't noticed before. In the reflection, I saw myself, but wearing the hotel manager's uniform from Theot photograph, my face gaunt and eyes hollow. I raised my hand. The reflection did the same, but its movement seemed to lag by a fraction of a second. I ran through doorways that hadn't been there before, down staircases that spiraled impossibly past windows that showed night outside despite my watch, reading only 4:17 p.m. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but terror drove me forward. Eventually, I collapsed against a wall, gasping for breath when I looked up, I was back in the lobby where ID started. Watery daylight streamed through the front doors, which stood slightly ajar. Freedom beckoned just feet away. I approached cautiously, suspicious of the hotel's apparent willingness to release me as I reached the threshold. I felt resistance, as if the air itself had thickened. Beyond the doors, I could see my car parked where I'd left it, impossibly still illuminated by morning light. With a final surge of determination, I pushed through the invisible barrier and stumbled into the parking lot. The fresh air hit my lungs like a shock, and I nearly fell to my knees in relief. I scrambled to my car, fumbling with the keys, constantly glancing back at the hotel's facade. As I pulled away from the Echo Harbor, I checked my watch. Again, it read 9:42 a.m. According to the dashboard clock, I had been inside for only 25 minutes in my rearview mirror. The hotel silhouette wet remained unchanged, its windows dark and empty. But as I turned the corner, I caught a glimpse of movement behind one of the third-floor windows, a figure in a dark suit watching my departure. I've submitted my resignation from the Echo Harbor project, citing health concerns. The City Council has already hired another architect to complete the assessment. In my dreams, I walk those endless crimson corridors, passing door after door. Sometimes I catch glimpses of my replacement, wandering the same halls, looking increasingly lost and desperate. And sometimes when I pass reflective surfaces, a shop window, a bathroom mirror, a computer screen gone dark, I see myself in that hotel manager's uniform, my eyes patient and knowing, waiting for me to return to the assessment that never ends. Because deep down I know the truth, I never actually left the Echo. Harbor Hotel, the world outside night, is just another corridor, another illusion created by a place that rewrites reality to keep its secrets. And sooner or later, all corridors lead back to those crimson halls. Some buildings have secrets that whisper from behind closed doors. Mine screams them through the walls at 3 a.m. I've lived in the Blackwood Apartments for nearly 2 years now. It's an older high-rise, 15 floors of faded grandeur, in a neighborhood that's seen better days. The rent is reasonable, and management handles most problems efficiently enough. But there's that one peculiarity that all residents eventually notice, the complete absence of a 13th floor. Initially, I assumed this was simple superstition. Many buildings skip from 12 to 14 to appease the take-up-phobic. But when I casually mentioned this to Mr. Torres, our building superintendent, his explanation caught me off guard. The 13th floor exists, he insisted, but remained unfinished due to budget constraints. When the original developer went bankrupt mid-construction, the current ownership never bothered completing it, leaving it as an empty concrete shell between the inhabited floors. I accepted this explanation without much thought until last Tuesday night I was returning home. Late after working overtime on a deadline-critical project, the digital display in the main elevator flashed 2:17 a.m. As I leaned against its wood panel wall, eyes burning from hours of staring at spreadsheets, the elevator glided upward, the floor numbers illuminating sequentially 10, 11, 12. The elevator stuttered momentarily, as it always did between 12 and 14, a mechanical hiccup I'd grown accustomed to. But this time, something caught my attention through the small gap between the elevator doors. A flicker of light where there should have been. Darkness. The glimpse was fleeting, but unmistakable. Warm yellow illumination spilling through the crack. Vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, I stepped off at my floor, but the image of that light plagued me as I prepared for bed. I dismissed it as exhaustion. Playing tricks on my perception, yet sleep refused to come. My mind returning to that impossible light on an uninhabited floor the following night, curiosity compelled me to investigate. I waited until the building settled into its nocturnal rhythm, when most residents had retreated behind their doors at 1:30 a.m. I took the service stairs descending from my 15th floor apartment until I reached the fire door marked 14. Continuing down one more flight brought me to an unmarked metal door, the phantom 13th floor. The heavy fire door was locked as expected, yet as I turned to leave, I noticed something that stopped me cold. A thin line of light seeped from beneath the door, placing my ear against the cool metal. I detected the muted murmur of voices too distant to discern words, but distinctly human. In cadence and tone, my heart began to quicken its rhythm, becoming more pronounced with each beat. Someone or something was occupying this supposedly vacant floor. I returned to my apartment and retrieved a small toolkit I kept for household repairs. 20 minutes later, I stood again before the 13th floor entrance, adrenaline rushing through my veins as I worked on the lock. I'm no professional, but years of locking myself out of various apartments had taught me rudimentary lock-picking skills. The mechanism finally yielded. With a satisfying click, I hesitated before pushing the door open, suddenly aware of the inappropriateness, perhaps even the danger of my actions. The rational part of my brain insisted I return upstairs and forget this foolishness. And instead, I slowly pressed the door inward. What greeted me defied all expectations. The service entrance opened onto a corridor that couldn't possibly exist within the building. I knew while the other floors featured utilitarian hallways with industrial carpeting and simple light fixtures. This space appeared meticulously designed and maintained. The walls were covered in cream-colored wallpaper with subtle gold patterns. Ornate sconces cast a warm glow over plush burgundy carpeting. Mahogany side tile, decorated with fresh flower arrangements, stood between elegant doors, each bearing brass numbers: 1301, 1302, 1303. My mouth went dry. The air felt different here, heavier somehow, with an undercurrent of something I couldn't identify. A faint scent of vanilla and sandalwood hung in the atmosphere, undercut by something else, something metallic and organic. I swallowed hard, my throat constricting, as I took hesitant steps forward. The corridor extended far longer than the building's dimensions should allow, curving slightly where it should have terminated at a fire escape. Each door I passed was identical solid wood with intricate carvings around the frame. The silence was absolute, contradicting the voices I'd heard moments earlier. As I ventured deeper, the feeling of being watched intensified. The hairs on my arms and neck stood rigid. A primitive response to perceived threat. Though I saw no one, I sensed eyes tracking my movement from behind the closed doors. My breathing grew shallow, each exhale visible as a small cloud in the increasingly cold air. I stopped outside apartment 1307, compelled by some instinct I couldn't explain. Unlike the others, this door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of deeper darkness beyond my skin, prickled with goose flesh. Logic demanded retreat, yet I found myself pushing the door wider. The apartment within was furnished as if its occupants had just stepped out momentarily. A half-empty cup of coffee sat on the side table, still faintly steaming. A newspaper was spread open on the leather armchair, its pages yellowed but the print crisp and legible. I approached, noticing the date at the top, June 17th, 1977. Sweat beaded on my forehead. Despite the chill, my fingertips tingled with a pins-in-needle sensation as I leafed through the newspaper, finding articles about events nearly 50 years past presented as current news. A sound from deeper within the apartment. The soft creak of weight shifting on floorboards froze me in place. The rational explanation, another curious resident perhaps did nothing to quell the primal terror seizing my chest. I backed toward the entrance, unable to tear my eyes from the darkened hallway leading to the apartment's interior rooms. "Hello," I managed to croak, my voice barely a whisper. No response came, but the quality of the silence changed. It became attentive, focused, waiting. I stumbled backward into the corridor, pulse hammering in my ears. The door to 1307 swung shut with deliberate slowness, no draft present to explain its movement, turning to flee. I discovered the hallway had changed. The elegant sconces now contained flickering bulbs that cast jumping shadows along the walls. The wallpaper had darkened with watermarks and age curling away from the corners. The carpet beneath my feet felt damp, I ran doors blurred past me as I sprinted toward where I believed the exit should be. Behind each, I heard sudden activity, muffled voices, hurried footsteps. The scraping of furniture, the building's impossible residents alerted to my presence, were stirring the corridor, stretched endlessly before me longer than physics should allow. My lungs burned, muscles protesting as cold sweat drenched my shirt, just as despair threatened to overwhelm me. I spotted the metal service door ahead. I crashed through it, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the concrete wall of the stairwell, gulping air into my starved lungs. My hands trembled violently as I fumbled for my phone, its screen indicating 3:47 a.m. I'd been inside for over 2 hours. Though it had felt like minutes, sleep was impossible that night. I sat in my living room until dawn, jumping at every creak and settling noise from the old building. When sunlight finally pierced my windows, I felt a measure of rational thought return. I convinced myself that stress and exhaustion had manufactured an elaborate hallucination to prove this to myself. I returned to the 13th floor that afternoon. The service door opened easily, revealing exactly what Mr. Torres had described. An unfinished concrete shell dust covered the floor, undisturbed save for my own footprints from the night before. Exposed wiring hung from the ceiling, and bare support columns stood where I had seen elegant walls. Construction materials lay abandoned, in corners gathering. Decades of grime relief washed over me, followed quickly by embarrassment at my midnight panic. Yet something still felt wrong. My footprints in the dust traced a path that matched my remembered journey down a corridor that couldn't exist in this empty space into a room that stood only as raw concrete. Now the path ended at a point where I'd apparently stood motionless for some time, facing a blank wall. I approached this spot drawn by some compulsion upon closer inspection. The wall wasn't entirely blank. Scratched into the concrete were numbers 1307. My skin crawled as I noticed something else on the floor beneath a single coffee cup bone, dry but unmistakably recent, with no layer of dust to suggest it belonged. With the decades-old construction materials, I backed away, a new theory forming that was somehow more disturbing than supernatural activity. Perhaps someone was secretly living here, creating elaborate scenarios. For what purpose? To frighten residents, to lure them into some trap I'd narrowly escaped. I reported my findings to building management. The proper property manager listened with thinly veiled skepticism, but promised to have security check the floor. 2 days later, she informed me they'd found nothing concerning, just an empty construction zone, no cup, no scratched numbers, and no evidence of occupation weeks past. I avoided thoughts of the 13th floor, throwing myself into work and social obligations. The experience gradually took on the quality of a vivid nightmare, disturbing but increasingly unreal with the passage of time. Until last night, I was awakened at precisely 3:13 a.m. by the sound of my television switching on by itself, broadcasting only static as I fumbled for the remote. I noticed the temperature in my bedroom had plummeted. My breath clouded before me as I rose from bed. The static from the television shifted subtly, the white noise resolving into something that approximated human speech, too distorted to understand, but carrying the unmistakable cadence of conversation. A chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature crawled up my spine on the screen. Barely visible through the static, I could make out an image, a hallway with cream-colored walls and burgundy carpeting. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text message from an unknown number contained only 3 words. "We're waiting upstairs." The elevator in my hallway activated its mechanical hum, audible through my apartment door. I heard it ascend past my floor, continuing upward to where no residential floors should exist above me. The cable's whirred, then stopped. A moment later, footsteps crossed the ceiling directly overhead, precisely where the phantom 13th floor would be, if the building's numbering made spatial sense. I haven't slept since the footsteps continued intermittently throughout the night, accompanied by the occasional sound of furniture being rearranged. Twice I heard after, not malevolent, but casual and ordinary, which somehow makes it more terrifying this morning. I asked Mrs. Patel from the apartment next door if she'd heard any strange noises overnight. She looked at me with concern, explaining that strange sounds were impossible. There is no 16th floor above us. The building ends at 15. I'm writing this now from a coffee shop 6 blocks away. I've called in sick to work. I don't know if I'm experiencing a psychotic break or if the what apartments exist in some impossible configuration that shifts and changes when no one is looking. What I do know is that I can't face returning tonight. Yet some part of me knows I will. Some part of me understands that whatever waits on the 13th floor has been patient for decades. It will continue waiting until curiosity or fate drives me back to that service door. And deep down in a place I'm afraid to acknowledge, I'm beginning to suspect I've always been meant to be there. That apartment 1307 has stood empty all these years, waiting for its intended occupant to finally arrive home. And the fog doesn't just surround this house, it consumes it on cold nights. It creeps under door frames and seeps through window cracks like spectral fingers, filling every room with its damp, suffocating presence. I've only lived here 3 months, but already I know its rhythms, how it rises from the valley below, as twilight fades, how it thickens until the world beyond my porch disappears entirely. But what I can't explain is why on those nights when the fog is thickest, the footsteps above my bedroom ceiling are at their loudest. I purchased the Hilltop Victorian at half its market value. A desperate steal from a bank that couldn't unload the property fast enough, the listing agent had been forthcoming about the house's quirks, as she called them, old pipes that groaned, floorboards that expanded and contracted with temperature changes, windows that rattled even on still nights. What she failed to mention was why the previous owner had left so abruptly, abandoning furniture, clothes, and personal effects, as if fleeing from some unseen danger. My first night in the house had been uneventful. I'd celebrated with a bottle of whiskey, falling asleep in the master bedroom, surrounded by boxes yet to be unpacked. It wasn't until the second week that I noticed something wasn't right. A family portrait I'd placed on the mantelpiece was lying face down on the hardwood floor one morning, its glass cracked in a spiderweb pattern. I assumed I'd placed it too close to the edge, though I distinctly remembered centering it carefully. 3 days later, my car keys vanished from the entryway table, where I always left them. After an hour of frantic searching, I found them in the back of the refrigerator, nestled between a carton of eggs and a bottle of ketchup. That same evening, I felt something brush against my shoulder while walking down the upstairs hallway. I spun around, heart racing, but found only empty air and lengthening shadows. The attic footsteps began on the 23rd night I'd been drifting to sleep, when the sound jolted me fully awake, deliberate, measured steps. Crossing directly above my bed, my rational mind insisted it was just the house settling, but houses don't settle in rhythmic patterns that mimic human gait. I grabbed a flashlight and the baseball bat, kept beside my bed, and climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The door creaked open to reveal exactly what the realtor had shown me months earlier. An empty space with exposed beams. Decades of dust and nothing that could explain the sounds I'd heard. I swept the flashlight beam across every corner, illuminating only cobwebs and abandoned bird nests near the small round window. Yet as I stood there, the air felt charged, as if the dust particles suspended in my flashlight beam were arranged in some deli pattern I couldn't quite discern. I slept with the lights on that night and the next when exhaustion finally forced me to turn them off. On the third night, I dreamed of a figure standing at the foot of my bed, motionless, watching. I couldn't make out its features, only its silhouette, tall, unnaturally. Thin with arms that hung too low, I awoke gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat. Despite the autumn chill that permeated the house, the locals at the small town's only diner were reluctant to discuss the property when I casually brought it up over breakfast. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with eyes that had seen too much, would only say that the Hilltop house had a history when pressed. She lowered her voice and suggested I speak with old Martin at the Historical Society. If I wanted details, her parting words as I left still echo in my mind. Some houses aren't empty, even when no one lives in them. I never made it to the Historical Society instead. I threw myself into renovation projects, convinced that physical labor would drown out the growing unease that followed me through the house. I tore up old carpeting, replaced rotten porch boards, and repainted the kitchen a bright, cheerful yellow that seemed to darken to sickly mustard. When the fog rolled in one afternoon, while replacing a broken light fixture in the dining room, I found something tucked into the ceiling cavity. A small leather journal, its pages yellow. With age, the entries dated back to 1963, written in a tight, slanting script. Most were mundane accounts of daily life, but certain passages stood out with disturbing clarity. April 17th, 1963. It's watching me through the fog again tonight, standing just beyond the edge of the porch. Lights reach. I know it's there, by the way. The mist swirls in one spot like water circling a drain. May 2nd, 1963. Found my reading glasses in the fireplace this morning. The left lens was cracked. I never go near the fireplace. Haven't lit it once. This spring, June 14th, 1963. The footsteps in the attic won't stop. I've searched every inch, nothing but when I stand very still, I can hear something breathing in the corners where the shadows are deepest. The final entry was dated July 8th, 1963, and contained only 5 words it knows I found it. My throat constricted as I realized the journal must have belonged to the previous owner. Not the man who had fled so suddenly, but someone from decades earlier. Had they experienced the same phenomena? Had every occupant of this house felt the same growing dread that now followed me from room to room? That night, the fog was thicker than I'd ever seen it. It pressed against the windows like a living thing, leaving condensation trails that resembled elongated handprints. I double-checked every lock, drew every curtain, and still couldn't shake the sensation of being observed. The footsteps in the attic were more insistent now, no longer attempting to disguise themselves as normal house noises. They paced relentlessly, occasionally stopping directly above wherever I happened to be. I tried drowning them out with music, then television, but every sound from my speakers came out distorted voices, stretched and warped into unrecognizable moans. By midnight, I sat in complete silence, listening to the house breathe around me. The walls seemed to expand and contract with each distant footstep. My breaking point came 3 nights later. I'd fallen into an exhausted sleep after 2 days of insomnia, only to be yanked back to consciousness by the sensation of pressure on my chest. My eyes flew open to darkness so complete, I couldn't tell if they were actually open at all. The weight increased, pressing the air from my lungs in thin, desperate wheezes. I tried to move to fight against whatever was crushing me, but my limbs were lean. Unresponsive from the darkness came a whisper so close to my ear, I could feel cold breath against my skin. The words were indistinct at first, like static between radio stations, but slowly clarified into a single, repeated phrase found. You hid, you found. You hid, you, with a surge of adrenaline born of pure terror. I broke through the paralysis and lunged for the bedside lamp. Light flooded the room, revealing nothing. No intruder, no explanation for the weight that had felt so real moments before, but arranged on the floor beside my bed, placed with obvious deliberation, were all the items that had gone missing since I moved in. Keys, watches, pens, a missing shoe, dozens of objects forming a perfect circle around where I slept. My hands trembled violently as I packed a bag. Dawn was still hours away, but I couldn't spend another minute in that house as I threw clothes haphazard into a duffel bag. My peripheral vision caught movement, the bedroom door slowly swinging closed. No draft could explain it all. The windows were sealed against the fog that continued to press against the glass. I forced myself to cross the room and wrenched the door back open, half expecting to confront whatever entity had been stalking me through the house. The hallway stretched empty before me, but something was different. All the doors that lined the corridor, doors to the bathroom, the guest bedroom, the linen closet, were now shut tight. I distinctly remembered leaving them open, a habit I developed to convince myself no one was hiding inside my heart. Hammered against my ribs as I moved toward the staircase, bag clutched to my chest like a shield. The wooden steps groaned beneath my weight, a normal sound, I told myself, just old wood complaining. But halfway down I froze. Rising from the first floor was another sound. Footsteps identical to those I'd been hearing in the attic. Now directly below me, cold sweat trickled down my spine as I realized I was caught between whatever lurked above and below the footsteps below, paused as if their owner was listening for my next move. I stood paralyzed on the middle step, my breath coming in shallow gasps that seemed thunderous in the silence when the footsteps began again. They weren't moving randomly, they were coming toward the staircase. I retreated upward, abandoning my plan to flee back in the master bedroom. I slammed the door and dragged a heavy dresser in front of it. The wood scraped loudly against the floor. I was beyond caring about stealth now. Through the window I could see nothing but dense white fog, a blank canvas that seemed to pulse with malevolent awareness. For hours, I sat with my back against the wall, listening to the house. Sometimes the footsteps were in the hallway, pacing outside my barricaded door. Sometimes they returned to the attic, resuming their endless circuit above my head. Occasionally, they disappeared entirely, leaving a silence so profound it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Dawn came with agonizing slowness as the first gray light filtered through the fog. I moved the dresser and inched the door open. The hallway was empty. I crept downstairs, flinching at every creak and groan from the old house. The front door stood open, though I was certain I'd locked it the night before. Beyond it, the porch and front yard were still shrouded in thinning mist. My car sat in the driveway, exactly where I'd left it. Escape was just 30 feet away. I was halfway across the porch when something made me turn back for one final look at the house. My blood froze in my veins there in the attic window. The small round window I'd examined myself was a face not human, not fully formed, but a suggestion of features in the swirling fog that had somehow penetrated the sealed glass. It had no eyes that I could discern, yet I felt its gaze lock onto mine with predatory intensity. I ran to my car, fumbling with keys, certain that any moment I would feel cold hands on my shoulders pulling me back toward the house. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the winding hillside road, watching the Victorian grow smaller in my rearview mirror until the fog swallowed it completely. I haven't returned to the house on the hill. I left everything behind, furniture, clothes, the life I'd planned to build there. Sometimes I consider contacting the authorities, though I can't imagine explaining what drove me away. What would I tell them then that the house wasn't empty when I bought it, that something moves within its walls, rearranging belongings and whispering in the darkness? I've taken a small apartment in a city 200 miles away. The noise of traffic and neighbors is constant, comforting in its human predictability. But some nights when fog rolls in from the nearby river, I wake to the sound of measured footsteps in the apartment above mine. And when I check my kitchen in the morning, sometimes objects aren't where I left them. I try to convince myself it's stress and overactive imagination, traumatized by weeks of sleep deprivation in that hilltop house. But deep down, I know the truth that the journal writer discovered, that perhaps every occupant eventually learns. Some things don't haunt houses, they haunt people. And once they found you, nowhere is far enough to hide. Last week, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single yellowed page that appeared torn from a journal I recognized. All too well, the message was brief, written in that same slanting script. It follows those who see it. I'm sorry you found my warning too late. Perhaps you can warn the next one. I've written this account as my warning. If you've recently purchased a Victorian house atop a hill, if you've noticed small objects disappearing, if you hear footsteps where no one walks, leave now. Don't wait until nightfall. WS, don't wait for the fog to rise. And whatever you do, don't look back at the attic window. It wants to be seen. That's how it finds its way in, and the faces appeared on the third consecutive night, not reflections. I'm certain of that much. Reflections don't press against glass from the outside of a train moving 70 miles per hour through absolute darkness. Reflections don't have eyes that follow your movements with desperate intensity. And reflections certainly don't mouth words, silently, pleadingly, as though begging to be let inside. I've taken the Midnight Express from Boston to Milford for 6 years. Now the 12:40 a.m. departure fits my schedule perfectly, late enough to finish my shift at the hospital, early enough to grab a few hours of sleep before returning to work the next day. The routine had become so familiar that I could time the journey by the landmarks that punctuated the darkness. The abandoned paper mill at 1:02, the curve around Lake Whitehall at 1:17, the long stretch of pine forest that signaled we were 15 minutes from arrival. The night runs were always sparsely populated, a few late shift workers like myself. The occasional insomniac, sometimes a group of inebriated college students. I preferred it that way. The emptiness, the quiet, the solitude that allowed me to decompress after 12 hours of other people's pain and suffering. I always chose a window seat in the last car where I could stare out at the passing darkness, my own face reflected back at me against the black canvas of rural Massachusetts. The gentle rocking of the train usually lulled me into a trance-like state. Not quite sleep, but something close to it, a temporary. suspension of consciousness that was before the first one appeared. As we passed the old mill, a pale oval pressed against the glass so sudden that I jerked back in my seat, heart hammering against my ribs. For a moment I thought someone had thrown something at the train. It wouldn't be the first time local teenagers had hurled rocks or bottles at the passing cars. But then the oval resolved into a face-gaunt hollow, with a mouth stretched wide in what could have been either a grin or a grimace. The train's interior lights reflected off the glass, making it difficult to discern details. But I could see enough to know that what I was looking at wasn't possible. The face kept pace with the train sliding alongside my window for several seconds before vanishing. As we passed beneath a crossing, signal my pulse thrummed in my ears. I pressed my face closer to the glass, scanning the darkness, telling myself I'd imagined it a trick of the light, a momentary hallucination born from exhaustion. I'd been working double shifts all week. My mind was playing tricks on me. Then another face appeared, this one different from the first, with deep-set eyes and sagging jowls. It pressed harder against the glass as though trying to force its way through by sheer pressure. The lips moved, forming words I couldn't understand. I recoiled, nearly falling into the aisle. A woman seated several rows ahead turned to look at me, her expression questioning. I muttered an apology and settled back into my seat, keeping my gaze fixed firmly on the back of the seat in front of me. Curiosity, or perhaps something darker, eventually drew my eyes back to the window. Nothing there now but my own reflection, pale and wide-eyed sweat. Bead on my forehead despite the car's aggressive air conditioning, I wiped it away with a trembling hand and told myself it was over. It wasn't the next night I considered taking an Uber home. The thought of boarding that train again made my stomach clench. But the surge pricing would have cost more than I could justify on my medical technician salary. Besides, what would I tell myself? That I was afraid of faces that couldn't possibly exist? That I was running from figments of my imagination? I boarded the train and took my usual seat, though I kept my gaze fixed on my phone, scrolling mindlessly through social media feeds. Without really seeing them, we were 10 minutes into the journey when the temperature in the car seemed to drop. I felt it first as a prickling along my forearms, then as a deep chill that penetrated to my bones. My breath fogged in front of me. No one else in the car seemed to notice. I knew what was happening before I looked up. Knew and looked anyway. Three faces this time pressed so hard against the glass that their features distorted two men and a woman, their expressions contorted with what I now recognized as pain. The woman's mouth opened in a silent scream, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp. One of the men's eyes leaked a dark fluid that trailed upward against the glass as though gravity had no hold on him. Their lips moved in unison, forming the same word over and over. Please. I squeezed my eyes shut and counted to 10, then 20, then 50 when I opened them again. The faces were gone, but the chill remained, and with it a sense of dread that followed me home and lingered in the corners of my apartment, watching me as I tossed and turned. Through a sleepless night, I called in sick the following day. Spent the hours researching the train line, looking for accidents and derailments. Anything that might explain what I was seeing. I found a few minor incidents, but nothing catastrophic. Nothing that would explain the faces or the desperation in their eyes. I dug deeper, searching forums and local news archives, found nothing. By evening, I'd convinced myself that stress and sleep deprivation were to blame. I'd been working too hard, sleeping too little. The human mind is remarkably adept at manufacturing horrors when stretched too thin. I took 2 melatonin tablets, hoping for dreamless sleep, and set my alarm for my usual time. The third night, I almost didn't go to the station, almost called another Uber CBI damned, but some compulsion drove me there. Some need to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I arrived early, pacing the platform until the train pulled in. As I boarded, the conductor, a heavy-set man with a salt and pepper beard, who'd been working this route as long as I'd been riding it, gave me a curious look. "You all right there?" he asked, his Boston accent, stretching the words, looking a bit peaky. I assured him I was fine, just tired. He nodded, unconvinced, and mentioned that the storm coming in might make for a bumpy ride. I glanced at the sky, clear star, studded, not a cloud in sight. When I looked back, he was already moving down the platform, punching tickets. I boarded the train. My unease deepening, this time I chose a seat on the aisle away from the windows. But as we pulled out of the station, I found my gaze drawn inexorably toward the glass. The night pressed against it, darker than usual, as though the stars had been extinguished. My reflection stared back at me, hollow-eyed and afraid. We passed the paper mill. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing happened. Relief washed over me, premature and short-lived, because as we rounded the curve toward Lake White, every window in the car exploded with faces, not 3 or 4, but dozens pressed together like sardines, a grotesque mosaic of anguished expressions, men and women of all ages, their features distorted not just by pressure against the glass, but by something more fundamental, as though the very structure of their faces had been altered. Some had eyes too large or too small. Others had mouths that stretched impossibly wide. Still others seemed to have too many features crowded onto too little space. A strangled sound escaped my throat. I clapped a hand over my mouth to prevent another. The few other passengers in the car continued their various activities, reading, dozing, staring at phones, oblivious to the horror show. Playing out on the windows, I wanted to scream at them, to demand how they could ignore what was happening. But I knew the answer. They couldn't see them only. I could the faces pressed harder against the glass, which began to bow inward, defying both physics and sanity. Their silent pleas became more urgent, more desperate. Let us in. They mouthed, help us, please. I stumbled to my feet, lurching down the aisle toward the door between cars behind me. I heard the sound of cracking glass. The temperature plummeted further, frost crystallizing on the metal handrails. My lungs burned with each breath as I threw myself through the door, into the next car, empty every seat. Vacant, the overhead lights flickered, dimmed, then stabilized at half brightness outside the windows. Nothing but darkness, no faces. No landscape, just an impenetrable void. Relief lasted only seconds before I realized what this meant. I was trapped between cars filled with those things in the absolute unknown. I moved through the car slowly. My footsteps echoing each window I passed remained mercifully empty, but I could feel eyes on me watching from just beyond perception. At the far end of the car, the conductor stood with his back to me, silhouetted against the dim light. We're approaching Milford Station, he said without turning. This will be your stop. His voice sounded wrong. Hollow, distant, as though coming from the bottom of a well. I asked him what was happening, why the train was empty, what those things were outside, inside the windows. He turned then, and I saw his face, or rather the absence where his face should have been. A blank expanse of skin, smooth and featureless, except for a small puckered opening where his mouth should be. They were passengers, once he said the words emerging from that terrible. Everyone who rides these rails becomes a passenger forever in one form or another. The ones outside, they got off before their stop tried to escape. There's no escaping the journey. Once you've boarded, ice formed in my veins. I backed away, stumbling over my own feet. The train began to slow, the familiar sensation of approaching a station. Through the windows, I could now see lights, the platform at Milford, my stop home. You have a choice to make. The conductor said as a face turned toward me, stay on until your proper stop, whenever and wherever that may be. Or try your luck out there with them. They want in because they know what waits in the darkness between stations. But once you join them, there's only one way back aboard the train ground to a halt. The doors hissed open behind me, letting in a gust of cold, fresh air. Freedom, safety, home. All I had to do was step off. Leave this nightmare behind. I made my choice. That was 3 months ago. I still take the Midnight Express from Boston to Milford. Still sit by the window, though I no longer look out at the passing landscape. The conductor, the real one, with a salt and pepper beard and kind eyes, knows me by name. Now asks about my day, tells me to rest up before my next shift. Sometimes as we pass the old paper mill or curve around Lake White Hall, I feel a chill that has nothing to do with the air conditioning. Feel eyes on me from outside the glass. I don't look, never look, but I know they're there waiting, watching, hoping I'll invite them in. I wonder sometimes about the thing that wore the conductor's uniform that night. Wonder if it told me the truth about what happens to those who leave the train before their time. Wonder when my proper stop will come and what will happen if I miss it. But mostly I wonder about the choices we make when faced with the unknown that night, standing at the threshold between nightmare and reality. I chose to step off the train, chose to run through the station and not stop until I reached the bright lights of the taxi stand, then home where I collapsed into a dreamless sleep. For 14 straight hours, I chose to believe that what I experienced was a hallucination, a waking nightmare. Born from exhaustion and stress, chose to return to work, to my routine, to my life, chose to board that same train the next night and the night after, and every night since. But sometimes, catching my reflection in the train window, I see something else gazing back. Something with my face but not my eyes, and in those moments I'm no longer certain which choice I actually made that night, or if I was ever given a choice at all. I only know one thing for certain. I will never open the window, no matter how desperately they plead, no matter how pitiful their silent cries. I will keep the glass between us, because deep down in a place beyond reason or explanation, I understand the truth. The faces at the window aren't trying to get in. They're warning me not to get out. The first time I heard it, that low guttural sound from within the marble, I convinced myself it was just the old building. Settling museums have their own voices, the creak of century-old floorboards, the whisper of climate control systems, the muted echoes of footsteps across grand halls. But this sound was different, organic, like something taking its first painful breath after centuries of silence. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I've spent 20 years restoring sculptures for institutions across the country. When the Metropolitan Museum of Art contacted me about a special collection of Renaissance-era pieces, recently acquired from a private collector in Italy, I accepted immediately. The prestige alone was worth it, but the contract's financial terms would keep my studio running for years. What I didn't anticipate was that I'd be working with something that defied all natural laws, something that would make me question the boundary between art and life itself. The collection arrived in climate-controlled crates, each piece meticulously packed. Most were conventional cherubs with chipped wings, nymphs missing fingers, a warrior with a cracked shield, standard restoration work. But the final crate contained something else entirely. As the museum staff lifted the protective coverings, a collective hush fell over the room. Standing before us was the figure of a man life-sized and carved from unusually dark marble, almost obsidian in its depth. Though the curator assured me it was a rare form of black Carrara, the craftsmanship was extraordinary. Every muscle was defined with anatomical precision. Veins seemed to run beneath the surface of the stone. The facial expression captured a disturbing mixture of ecstasy and agony. It was signed simply Visconti at its base, a name I'd encountered only in obscure art history texts. We're most concerned about this piece. Dr. Harrison, the curator, explained while adjusting her glasses. She pointed to a network of fine cracks spreading across the statue's torso. These fissures are expanding, though we can't determine why. Temperature fluctuations, perhaps, or stress during transport. I nodded, running my gloved hand along the surface. The marble felt unusually warm, almost body temperature. I attributed this to the gallery lighting and made a note to check the room's climate control settings. They provided me with a private restoration space in the museum's basement level, a large, well-equipped room with proper lighting and ventilation. The work would take weeks, possibly months. I could come and go as needed, even after hours with my security clearance. The first few days were routine documenting, existing damage testing adhesives on marble samples, carefully cleaning. Decades of accumulated grime from the surface. It was during my fourth evening, working late after the museum had closed to visitors, when I first noticed something strange as I wiped preservative solution across the statue's chest. I could have sworn I felt a subtle movement beneath my hand, the slightest rise and fall like shallow breathing. My heart rate spiked instantly, adrenaline flooding my system. I jerked my hand away, nearly dropping my tools. Sweat beat on my forehead. Despite the room's cool temperature, I forced a laugh at my own imagination. Marble doesn't breathe. I'd been working 16-hour days, surviving on vending machine coffee and too little sleep. Clearly, my mind was playing tricks. I continued working, but found myself repeatedly glancing at the statue's face. Had its expression changed? The lips seemed slightly less pressed together than I remembered. I checked my earlier photographs. No, the expression was the same, just tricks of light and shadow. I told myself, ignoring the way my hands had begun to tremble. The night guard Hector stopped by around midnight to check on me. I casually asked if he'd noticed anything unusual about the statue. The question seemed to make him uncomfortable. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, eyes darting to the corners of the room. Rather than looking at the piece directly, he finally admitted that the security team avoided this section during night rounds. Strange sounds, he said, movements and peripheral vision. One guard had requested transfer to another wing. Entirely, I laughed it off, pretending his stories didn't make my skin crawl. But that night I packed up earlier than planned. My dreams were troubled. I saw the statue moving in small, painful increments while I slept in the nightmare. I approached it, placing my ear against the cold marble, only to hear a heartbeat within slow but unmistakable. The next morning I arrived early and found something that stopped me. Cold new cracks had appeared overnight, spreading like veins across the statue surface. This wasn't normal material degradation. The patterns were too organic, too deliberate. They resembled circulatory pathways, as if mapping a system beneath the stone. I photographed everything measuring the progression. I began researching Visconti obsessively during my breaks. Academic databases yielded little but in obscure art forms in historical archives. Disturbing patterns emerged. Giovanni Visconti had been active in the late 16th century, a contemporary of Cellini, but far less known. His works were rare, with many disappearing from his iCal record entirely. What remained were rumors, disturbing accounts of models who vanished, of Visconti's descent into occult practices, of his claim that he had discovered the secret to imprisoning life within stone. Most historians dismiss these as typical Renaissance-era superstitions, but one account from a member of the Medici court described witnessing a Visconti sculpture with veins that seemed to pulse beneath the marble. The description matched my statue with unsettling precission. During the second week of restoration, I began hearing the sounds more distinctly, working with my tools against the statue surface. Amplified them low, resonant moans that seemed to emanate from within the marble itself. I recorded them on my phone, playing them back at higher volumes. They were structured almost language-like, but in no tongue. I recognized the physical changes, accelerated the cracks, widened imperceptibly each day. The surface temperature rose. I measured it at nearly 80 degrees Fahrenheit, well above the ambient room temperature, and there was the moisture, a slight dampness that collected in the deepening fissures. Too viscous to be condensation, I collected samples, secretly not yet ready to share my observations with the museum staff. I found myself talking to it sometimes when alone in the lab, asking what it wanted. What it was, the questions of a man losing his grip on reality, I knew. But I couldn't help myself. My hands developed a constant tremor. Sleep became nearly impossible. I lost weight. My clothes hanging loose from my frame, the security cameras captured me, pacing around the statue at 3 in the morning. Though I had no memory of coming to the museum at that hour, one of the junior curators, Eliza, noticed my deterioration. She cornered me in the cafeteria, asking pointed questions about my well-being. I deflected, but she persisted, mentioning that I wasn't the first restorer to work on Visconti pieces, who had experienced difficulties. The previous curator had removed all reference to the statue's provenance from the collection records, she revealed in a hushed tone. When I pressed for more information, she glanced nervously over her shoulder and suggested I investigate the private journals of Sebastian Miller, an art historian who had studied Visconti in the 1950s before supposedly committing himself to an asylum. I found Miller's journals archived in a university library across town. The writings began as academic analysis but devolved into paranoid ramblings. He described Visconti's techniques in disturbing detail, how the artist allegedly abducted victims and used a combination of unknown chemicals and ritual invocations to transmute living flesh partially to stone, creating a terrible half-existence. The final entries described Miller's certainty that one such creation was trying to communicate with him to finish a transformation. Begun centuries ago, the laboratory began to feel like a prison cell. Yet I couldn't stay away. The statue demanded my presence. I became convinced that my restoration work was accelerating whatever process had begun, that removing the accumulated grime of centuries was allowing it to move more freely. The cracks now resembled wounds, and the secretions from within had become undeniably blood-red. In consistency, I installed a motion-activated camera one night, aiming it directly at the statue. The next morning, the data was corrupted, but a single frame remained intact, showing the statue's hand in a position several inches from where I had left it. My paranoia reached unbearable levels. I felt eyes on me constantly. Not just the statue's empty gaze, but watching from every shadow in the museum. The night security guards reported unusual power fluctuations throughout the building, temperature drops, equipment failures, all radiating outward from my restoration room. I finally confided in Dr. Harrison, showing her my documentation, the recordings, the samples I'd collected too. My surprise, she didn't dismiss me outright. Instead, her face drained of color as she examined my evidence. She admitted that 3 previous Visconti pieces acquired by other museums had been removed from display after unexplained incident. She'd hoped this one would be different that night, working later than I should have. I made a critical discovery under ultraviolet light revealed beneath centuries of accumulated grime. On the statue's base was an inscription I had missed in my initial assessment, ancient Italian in a dialect I barely understood. I photographed it and sent it to a linguist colleague who responded within hours, his message marked urgent. "This is not a signature," he wrote. "It's a warning, roughly translated, I am not stone. Made flesh, but flesh made stone, free me and be taken in my place." My hands shook so violently I dropped my phone in that moment. The low, distant moon from within the statue became a clear, unmistakable whisper. My name repeated over and over, the temperature in the room plummeted, my breath fogging before me. Despite the summer heat outside, the cracks along the statue's surface widened, visibly dark fluid, seeping through like blood from a wound. I backed toward the door, unable to tear my gaze from the statue's face, which had undeniably changed. The eyes were no longer empty, hollows but seemed to hold depth and awareness. The lips had parted slightly, revealing teeth beneath, not carved teeth, real ones. I fled the room, racing through dark galleries, past shadowed sculptures that all seemed to turn their heads to follow my movement. I tripped over my own feet, sprawling across the marble floor of the main hall, my face reflected in the polished surface, alongside another reflection that shouldn't have been there. A dark figure standing where no one stood. Security found me. They're hyperventilating, unable to form coherent sentences. They escorted me out, suggesting I take time off. I nodded numbly, knowing I would never return. 3 days later, still recovering in my apartment, I received a text from Eliza. The statue had been moved to secure storage following an incident with a night guard who had been found catatonic in the restoration room, his hands pressed against the statue's chest. But more disturbing was what they discovered when examining the statue under CT, scanning evidence of an organic structure within the marble bone's organs, a preserved human nervous system encased in stone, but somehow impossibly still showing signs of electrical activity. The museum quietly returned the piece to its original collector. The official explanation cited irreparable structural damage, making restoration impossible. My contract was paid in full with a generous bonus in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement. I signed without hesitation. I've abandoned restoration work entirely. My hands shake too badly now to hold the delicate tools of my former trade. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I feel a presence in my apartment, watching, waiting. I've begun to notice fine webite cracks spreading across my fingertips, hardening, turning my flesh pale as marble. And in my dreams, I hear that voice again, whispering that our work together remains unfinished. I wonder how long until I become another unsigned masterpiece, flesh, made stone, waiting for someone to free me. The first night I spent in Blackwood Manor, I knew something was wrong. Not in the obvious way, no spectral apparitions or blood-stained walls, but in the subtle pressure that seemed to fill the spaces between objects like the air itself had weight. The mansion stood isolated against the darkening sky, its weathered stone facade bearing the silent witness of 4 centuries I had come to catalog the Blackwood family's extensive collection of heirlooms, a prestigious opportunity for an antiquarian of my modest reputation. Yet as I settled into my assigned guest room that evening, the walls seemed to lean inward as if studying me with ancient, patient malice. I am not a superstitious man. My profession demands objectivity, a clinical detachment from the emotional residue that clings to historical objects. But Blackwood Manor defied rational explanation from the moment I crossed its threshold. Mrs. Blackwood, the current matriarch, a severe woman with eyes like polished stones, had given me a Perun tour before retreating to her wing of the house. Her instructions were precise catalog, everything in the East Wing document, Providence where possible, but under no circumstances. Disturb the locked room at the end of the third-floor corridor. The scratching began on the second night, a persistent rhythmic scraping that seemed to emanate from somewhere down the hallway. My first thought was mice, an inevitable companion in old estates, but the sound possessed a deliberate quality that set my teeth on edge. It started precisely at 3:17 a.m., according to my wristwatch, and continued for exactly 12 minutes before stopping. Abruptly, I told myself it was the natural settling of an ancient structure, the contraction of old. Wood in the pre-dawn chill, by the fourth night, I could no longer maintain this pretense. The scratching had grown more insistent, sometimes accompanied by a soft thewing, like something heavy being dragged across hardwood floors. My sleep-deprived mind began conjuring images I couldn't dispel. Gnarled fingers scraping desperately at the inside of a sealed container, a trapped entity seeking escape. I lay rigid in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs, sweat beating along my hairline. Despite the room's persistent chill during daylight hours, I immersed myself in the cataloging work. The Blackwood collection was remarkable centuries of accumulated wealth preserved in countless artifacts spanning multiple generations: Ming Dynasty, porcelain Renaissance paintings, Victorian jewelry, modernist sculptures, each piece exquisitely preserved. Yet as I documented each item, I began noticing peculiar ARI ties, a silver pocket watch that always showed 317, regardless of winding a hand-carved music box that emitted only discordant notes when played, a doll collection whose glass eyes seemed to track my movements across the room. I mentioned these oddities to Mrs. Blackwood over dinner one evening. Her knife paused midway through slicing her barely cooked steak, and something flashed behind her eyes, fear perhaps, or warning. Every Blackwood heirloom serves a purpose, she informed me. In measured tones, some items were never meant to be merely decorative. She suggested I focus solely on documentation, rather than speculation about function. The conversation shifted abruptly to the weather, and my questions dissolved in the heavy silence that followed that night. I dreamed of the locked room in my dream. I stood before its heavy oak door, watching black liquid seep from beneath it, pooling around my bare feet. The liquid was warm, almost hot, and seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. I awoke, gasping, my sheets drenched in sweat, the faint scent of copper lingering in my nostrils. The fifth day brought a thunderstorm that rattled the mansion's windows and cast the interior into premature darkness as I worked in the library cataloging a collection of first editions. The elderly groundskeeper shuffled in to stoke the fireplace. His gnarled hands trembled as he arranged the logs, and I seized the opportunity to inquire about the locked room. His reaction was immediate, a violent flinching, as if I had raised my hand to strike him. It was no place for the living, he muttered, refusing to meet my gaze. The Blackwoods had sealed it for good reason, nearly 70 years ago. Strange happenings, he said, objects that moved on their own windows, that opened to the night without human touch, whispering voices in empty corridors, not haunting exactly the grounds. Keeper was adamant about this point because nothing had ever died there. Nothing human anyway. The room simply existed in partial separation from the natural laws that govern the rest of the world. I asked if anyone had entered it since it was sealed. The old man's eyes widened, and he glanced nervously at the doorway. Before leaning closer, only once he whispered the previous curator. Some 15 years earlier, a woman of considerable academic standing, who had insisted on complete access to the collection. She entered the room on her 9th day at the manor, 3 days later. She was committed to an asylum, her coherence shattered. Beyond recovery, she remains there still. He added, staring unblinking into the middle distance that night. The scratching traveled no longer confined to the distant end of the corridor. It now seemed to emanate from directly outside my bedroom door. My mouth went desert dry as I watched the brass doorknob rotate slowly, incrementally before stopping and returning to its original position. The wood of the door itself began to bulge slightly inward, as if something were pressing against it with considerable force. My limbs felt lean, paralyzed by a fear so profound it transcended physical sensation. Morning found me exhausted, but determined fear had crystallized into obsession. I needed to see the locked room to confront whatever presence stalked the corridors at night during breakfast. I carefully steered the conversation toward the mansion's architectural history, expressing academic interest in viewing all original structural elements for my comprehensive documentation. Mrs. Blackwood studied me with naked suspicion, but eventually produced an iron key from her dress pocket, placing it on the table between us. With palpable reluctance, "If you insist on this course," she stated flatly, "I cannot be held responsible for the consequences I was to enter. Alone, take no items from the room, and under no circumstances remain after sunset." Her final warning came. As I rose from the table, some knowledge cannot be cataloged. Only survived the key felt unnaturally cold against my palm. As I approached the door that afternoon, standing before it, I experienced a momentary vertigo, as if the corridor had subtly tilted, reorienting itself around us. Singular point in space. The scratching sounds were absent in daylight, but I could swear I heard faint breathing from the other side of the weathered oak panel. My own breath came in short, shallow gasps. My shirt already clinging to my back with nervous perspiration, the lock mechanism turned with surprising ease, as if recently oiled, despite decades of supposed disuse. As the door swung inward, I was struck first by the room's temperature, at least 10 degrees colder than the hallway way behind me. My exhalations formed visible clouds in the frigid air. The chamber was larger than I had expected, its high ceiling disappearing into shadow. Despite the afternoon light streaming through tall, dust-covered windows, the walls were lined with portraits, generations of Blackwood, staring down with expressions of stern disapproval. Their eyes contained something beyond the usual fixed gaze of painted subjects, an awareness, a presence, that caused the hairs on my neck to stand rigid. Below the portrait stood furniture of various periods, Victorian chaises, Georgian writing desks, Edwardian display cabinets arranged not in any logical grouping, but in a rough approximation of a circle. I stepped fully into the room. Notepad clutched in my trembling hand, the door swung shut behind me with a decisive click that echoed abnormally long in the still air. The sense of being observed intensified, immediately pressing against my skin like an electrical field. I forced myself to breathe to focus on professional assessment, rather than the mounting dread that threatened to overwhelm rational thought. The first object I examined was a simple handheld mirror in a silver frame, resting atop a mahogany side table. As I lifted it, a whisper distinct and articulate, though unintelligible, sounded directly behind me. I spun around, heart thundering in my chest, but found only empty space. When I turned back, the mirror had moved several inches from where I set it down. This pattern repeated with each artifact. I attempted to document a music box that began playing, despite having no visible winding mechanism, a leather-bound journal whose pages turned of their own accord, when opened a chess set whose pieces rearranged themselves, when I glanced away with each inexplicable occurrence. The whispers grew more numerous, emanating from the very walls themselves, erration of overlapping voices just below the threshold of comprehension. I backed toward the center of the room, my professional composure shattered. The furniture had shifted position, subtly but unmistakably, the circle tightening around. Where I stood, the temperature continued to drop my breath, now forming dense white clouds before my face. The portraits seemed to have changed as well. The stern expressions now twisted into something approaching hunger, eyes following my movements with undisguised malevolence. My back collided with something solid, a tall cabinet that had not been there moments before. As I stumbled forward, the floor beneath me seemed to undulate slightly like a carpet, rippling over something moving beneath it. The whispers coalesced into a single word repeated with increasing urgency. Curator understanding broke over me like ice water. This room wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It was a collection point, a carefully constructed repository for something that existed between the material and immaterial worlds. Each object served as an anchor, a physical tether for entities that were never meant to be bound to our reality. And I, with my scholarly intrusion, had disturbed a delicate equilibrium, maintained for generations. The Blackwoods weren't collectors, they were wardens. My hand closed around the door handle, but it refused to turn. Panic flared hot in my chest as I pulled futilely at the unyielding brass behind me. The whispers had grown to a cacophony, the furniture now visibly sliding across the floor toward me. Of its own accord, one of the portraits, a particularly severe gentleman from what appeared to be the early 18th century, began to bubble and distort the painted surface, bulging outward as if something were pushing through from behind the canvas. My mind raced through options, rational thought fracturing under the weight of impossibility made manifest. Then I remembered Mrs. Blackwood's warning. Take nothing from the room. Perhaps the reverse held true as well. With shaking hands, I removed my wristwatch and placed it deliberately on the nearest surface. A small offering to whatever presence controlled this space, the effect was immediate. The whispers stopped abruptly, the furniture ceased its inexorable advance, and the distorted portrait settled back into 2 dimensions. The temperature rose several degrees in seconds. Most significantly, I heard the distinct click of the door unlocking behind me. I stumbled into the hallway, slamming the door shut and leaning against it, gulping air into my constricted lungs. My body trembled uncontrollably, cold sweat, plastering my clothes to my skin. Through the solid oak I could hear my wristwatch ticking at an impossible volume, its rhythm matching exactly the scratching sounds that had haunted my nights. I understood then what the groundskeeper had meant. Nothing had died in that room because death implies an ending. What existed there persisted in a state of perpetual hunger for objects, for attention, for curators who would acknowledge and catalog its existence. I left Blackwood Manor the next morning, my contract unfulfilled. My professional reputation likely damaged beyond repair. Mrs. Blackwood watched my departure with knowing eyes but asked no questions as my car navigated the long gravel driveway. I glanced back at the mansion's facade in a third-floor window. I saw a figure watching, not Mrs. Blackwood, but a man in outdated clothing, his stern features unmistakably matching. One of the portraits from the locked room, he raised his hand in acknowledgement. On his wrist gleamed the distinctive band of my watch. I still wake at exactly 3:17 each morning, heart racing, ears straining for scratching sounds that never come. My dreams are filled with whispers and portraits with moving eyes. Eyes, sometimes I find my possessions rearranged in the morning, forming rough approximations of circles on available surfaces. I've taken a position at a small university library since then, cataloging mundane academic texts with no history or provenance. Yet I cannot escape the certainty that I brought something back with me. Not an object, but an awareness. The Blackwood collection had recognized me as a suitable curator, and some connections once established cannot be severed by mere distance. Sometimes when I'm alone among the library stacks late at night, I hear whispering between the shelves, and occasionally when I glance at the security mirrors mounted in the corners, I catch a glimpse of stern-faced figures in outdated clothing watching me with patient, hungry eyes. They're waiting for me to resume my cataloging. The first ripple against the hole wasn't enough to wake me the second. Made the wooden floor creak beneath my sleeping bag. By the third, I was sitting upright, heart pounding against my ribs like something trapped and desperate to escape no wind. Disturbed the pines that surrounded the lake, no passing boat created waves. Yet our rented floating house swayed, as if pushed by unseen hands from the black water. Below, I'd chosen this place as a retreat from the city, a long weekend with 3 friends in a secluded spot where we could fish, drink beer, and disconnect from our digital lives. Pine Lake was perfect on paper, remote enough to feel like a genuine escape, yet only a 3-hour drive from home. The listing had shown sun-dappled water and a quaint floating cabin anchored 20 yards from shore. What it hadn't shown were the shadows that moved beneath the surface when darkness fell. Did you feel that I whispered to Mark in the bunk across from mine? But his steady breathing told me he remained asleep. Rob and Alan occupied the small bedroom down the narrow hallway, equally oblivious to the unnatural movement. Only I seemed to notice how wrong it felt, this gentle rocking that had no business existing on a windless night. I checked my phone, 3:17 a.m. The witching hour my grandmother would have called it, that Leo time. When the barrier between worlds grows thin, I pushed away her superstitious warnings, products of an old world upbringing, I'd long since dismissed as folklore meant to frighten children. The floorboards outside my door creaked with the unmistakable weight of footsteps. My throat constricted as I strained to listen. Another step, then another, deliberate and measured, moving across the main room toward the deck. I slid from my sleeping bag, careful not to wake Mark, and crept to our bedroom door. Through the crack, I could see the main living area illuminated only by moonlight filtering through the windows, empty, yet the footsteps continued now on the deck outside. I told myself it must be one of the guys, Rob or Alan, having trouble sleeping, stepping outside for fresh air. But then a shadow passed by the window. Too tall, too thin to be any of my friends, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. My breath clouded before me as goosebumps erupted across my skin. Another shadow moving in the opposite direction past the window. Then another shadow circling out, floating home like predators. I retreated to my bunk, convincing myself it was a trick of the moonlight on the water. Reflections playing on the glass sleep eventually reclaimed me, but my dreams were troubled by dark water and pale reaching hands. Morning brought sunlight and normally over coffee. I casually mentioned hearing strange noises in the night. My friends exchanged glances before Rob suggested it was probably just the house settling or fish bumping against the pontoons. Their explanation seemed reasonable in the brightness of day. We spent hours fishing, swimming, and lounging on the deck by afternoon. I'd almost forgotten my midnight terrors almost as the sun began. Its descent casting long shadows across the lake. I noticed how the water darkened, not just from the fading light, but as if something beneath absorbed what illumination remained. Alan suggested grilling the fish we'd caught, and soon we were enjoying a meal on the deck, passing around beers and sharing stories. None of us mentioned how the laughter seemed to die a little too quickly in the still air, or how our eyes kept drifting to the shoreline, where the pines stood like silent sentinels that night. I awoke to the same rocking motion, more pronounced than before. The digital clock on my phone read 3:17 a.m. Again, exactly the same time my skin prickled with cold sweat. As I heard those measured footsteps crossing the deck, I lay paralyzed, listening, as they circled the perimeter of our floating home. Then came a new sound, knuckles rapping against the wooden wall beside my head. 3 distinct knocks, a pause, 3 more knocks. Who's there? I called out immediately, regretting breaking the silence. No response came, only the continued knocking, moving around the cabin's exterior. Mark stirred in his bunk. "You say something," he mumbled sleepily. "Listen," I whispered, "someone's outside." We both fell silent. The knocking had stopped after a moment. Mark sighed. "It's just the water against the hull, man. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't shake the certainty that something was out there watching us through the windows, testing our boundaries. When I finally drifted back to sleep, I dreamed of dark water filling my lungs, pulling me down into depths where ancient eyes opened all around me. The second morning we awoke to find wet footprints on the deck, too large to belong to any of us. They LED from the water's edge, up onto the deck, circled the cabin, and disappeared back into the lake. Rob suggested a trespasser, perhaps, someone swimming out to our house as a prank. Alan wanted to call the property manager and report it. I said nothing about how the footprints seemed oddly spaced, or how they glistened with something that looked thicker than water. Instead, I found myself drawn to the lake's edge, staring into the dark water. For a moment, I thought I glimpsed movement in the depths, something large and pale shifting below the surface. When I blinked, it was gone that afternoon. While my friends napped inside, I sat alone on the deck with a fishing rod. I wasn't really using the lake stretched before me. Peaceful and ordinary in the daylight, an old man in a small rowboat passed by the first person we'd seen since arriving. I waved, and he paused his rowing to return the gesture I called out, asking if he lived nearby, and he nodded, pulling his boat closer. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades under the sun, his eyes pale and watery behind thick glasses when I mentioned the strange stir occurrences. His expression darkened. He spoke in measured tones about the lake's history, how it wasn't always a recreational spot. He told me about the town that had existed here 80 years ago, before the valley was intentionally flooded to create the reservoir. The town's people had been given notice, he said, but not everyone left. Some refused to abandon their homes, their churches, their graveyards. My stomach tightened as he described how the water rose slowly over days' swell, Following streets and buildings, he claimed that on certain nights, particularly when the moon was as full as it had been yesterday, those who remained below sometimes sought connection with the world above. I wanted to dismiss his story as local folklore meant to spook tourists, but something in his pale eyes stopped me. Before rowing away, he offered one piece of advice. Whatever I might hear in the night, whatever might call to me from the water, I should not answer. And under no circumstance should I enter the lake after dark that evening. None of us ventured into the water for our usual sunset swim. We stayed inside playing cards and drinking more than we had on previous nights. No one mentioned the footprints or the old man's warning I'd shared, but tension hung in the air like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. I awoke again at precisely 3:17 a.m., this time to the sound of something heavy dragging across the deck. The house rocked violently, water slapping against the hull. Mark sat upright in his bunk, his face pale in the moonlight streaming through our window. "What the hell is that?" he whispered before I could answer. A low moan drifted through the thin walls, not quite human, not quite animal. It rose and fell like a plane of call echoing across the water. Another voice joined it, then another until a chorus of eerie wailings surrounded our floating home. Rob and Al burst into our room, their eyes wide with fear. They'd heard it too. We huddled together, listening as the moans grew louder, more insistent. Then came the knocking, not just in one spot now, but all around the house, dozens of fists pounding against every surface. The wall shuddered under the assault through the window. I saw the water, its descent casting long shadows across the lake. I noticed how the water darkened, not just from the fading light, but as if something beneath absorbed what illumination remained. Alan suggested grilling the fish we'd caught, and soon we were enjoying a meal on the deck, passing around beers and sharing stories. None of us mentioned how the laughter seemed to die a little too quickly in the still air, or how our eyes kept drifting to the shoreline, where the pines stood like silent sentinels that night. I awoke to the same rocking motion, more pronounced than before. The digital clock on my phone read 3:17 a.m., again exactly the same time my skin prickled with cold sweat. As I heard those measured footsteps crossing the deck, I lay paralyzed listening as they circled the perimeter of our floating home. Then came a new sound, knuckles rapping against the wooden wall beside my head. 3 distinct knocks, a pause. 3 more knocks. "Who's there?" I called out immediately, regretting breaking the silence. No response came, only the continued knocking moving around the cabin's exterior. Mark stirred in his bunk. "You say something," he mumbled sleepily. "Listen." I whispered, "Someone's outside." We both fell silent. The knocking had stopped after a moment. Mark sighed. "It's just the water against the hull, man. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't shake the certainty that something was out there, watching us through the windows, testing our boundaries. When I finally drifted back to sleep, I dreamed of dark water filling my lungs, pulling me down into depths where ancient eyes opened all around me. The second morning, we awoke to find wet footprints on the deck, too large to belong to any of us. They LED from the water's edge, up onto the deck, circled the cabin, and disappeared back into the lake. Rob suggested a trespasser, perhaps someone swimming out to our house as a prank. Alan wanted to call the property manager and report it. I said nothing about how the footprints seemed oddly spaced or how they glistened with something that looked thicker than water. Instead, I found myself drawn to the lake's edge, staring into the dark water. For a moment, I thought I glimpsed movement in the depths, something large and pale shifting below the surface. When I blinked, it was gone that afternoon. While my friends napped inside, I sat alone on the deck with a fishing rod. I wasn't really using the lake stretch before me. Peaceful and ordinary in the daylight, an old man in a small rowboat passed by the first person we'd seen since arriving. I waved and he paused his rowing to return the gesture I called out, asking if he lived nearby, and he nodded, pulling his boat closer. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades under the sun, his eyes pale and watery behind thick glasses when I mentioned the strange star occurrences. His expression darkened. He spoke in measured tones about the lake's history, how it wasn't always a recreational spot. He told me about the town that had existed here 80 years ago, before the valley was intentionally flooded. To create the reservoir, the townspeople had been given notice, he said. But not everyone left. Some refused to abandon their homes. their churches, their graveyards. My stomach tightened as he described how the water rose slowly over days while following streets and buildings. He claimed that on certain nights, particularly when the moon was as full as it had been yesterday, those who remained below sometimes sought connection with the world above. I wanted to dismiss his story as local folklore meant to spook tourists, but something in his pale eyes stopped me. Before rowing away, he offered one piece of advice: whatever I might hear in the night, whatever might call to me from the water, I should not answer. And under no circumstance should I enter the lake after dark. That evening, none of us ventured into the water for our usual sunset swim. We stayed inside playing cards and drinking more than we had on previous nights. No one mentioned the footprints or the old man's warning I'd shared, but tension hung in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. I awoke again at precisely 3:17 a.m., this time to the sound of something heavy dragging across the deck. The house rocked violently, water slapping against the hull. Mark sat upright in his bunk, his face pale in the moonlight streaming through our window. "What the hell is that?" he whispered before I could answer. A low moan drifted through the thin walls, not quite human, not quite animal. It rose and fell like a plaintive call echoing across the water. Another voice joined it, then another, until a chorus of eerie wailing surrounded our floating home. Rob and Al burst into our room, their eyes wide with fear. They'd heard it too. We huddled together, listening as the moans grew louder, more insistent. Then came the knocking, not just in one spot now, but all around the house, dozens of fists pounding against every surface. The walls shuddered under the assault through the window. I saw the water around our house churning, as if boiling, though no heat. Rose from it, dark shapes moved beneath the surface, circling our home like sharks around prey. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The knocking ceased, the moans faded, the water grew still in the abrupt silence. We heard a clear voice, gentle beckoning, calling my name from directly beneath the floorboards. My friends claimed they heard nothing, but I couldn't mistake the voice calling to me. Specifically, it knew me. It wanted me something ancient and patient, waited in the depths below, and it had chosen me as its conduit. We spent the remainder of the night huddled in the main room, lights blazing, jumping at every creak and groan of the structure. None of us spoke about leaving early, though I could see the thought in their eyes, some unspoken masculine pride, prevented us from admitting we were terrified of spending another night on the lake. The next day passed in a fog of exhaustion and dread. We went through the motions of enjoying ourselves, but our laughter was forced, our conversation stilted. I found myself drawn repeatedly to the edge of the deck, staring into the water, where I could now definitely see movement, pale shapes drifting just beyond clear visibility. As evening approached, Rob finally suggested we cut our trip short. No one objected. We began packing our belongings, working with the hurried efficiency of men, fleeing something they couldn't acknowledge. But as the sun dipped below the tree line, thick fog rolled across the lake, enveloping our floating house in an impenetrable white shroud. The shore, only 20 yards away, vanished completely from view. Mark tried starting the small motorboat we'd used to FY ourselves from shore, but the engine sputtered and died again and again. He pulled the cord each attempt more desperate than the last, until Rob placed a hand on his shoulder. "We're staying another night," he said, his voice flat with resignation. That final night, none of us pretended to sleep. We sat in the main room, backs against the walls, a bottle of whiskey passing between us as we waited for 3:17 a.m. No one questioned that the time held significance. No one doubted that something would happen when that hour arrived. The digital clock on my phone flipped to 3:17, and the house began to rock. Not the gentle swaying of previous nights, but violent lurching that sent furniture sliding across Ross. The floor water soused over the deck as if a massive object was displacing it from below. The knocking came next, thunderous pounding that threatened to splinter the wood through the windows. I saw pale faces pressing against the glass features, distorted, and fluid mouths open in silent screams or hungry anticipation. My friends saw them too. Alan began praying in a shaking voice while Rob and Mark pressed themselves further against the wall. The floor beneath us bulged upward as if something massive was pushing. From below, boards creaked and nails groaned under the pressure. Water began seeping through the seams, black and viscous, smelling of decay and forgotten depths. And through it all, I heard my name called clearly and lovingly by that same voice from the deep. It promised understanding. If only I would answer revelation. If only I would join it below the surface. It spoke of ancient knowledge waiting in the drowned town secrets, preserved in waterlogged chambers, where time moved differently. My friends didn't hear the voice, but they saw something in my expression that alarmed them. Rob grabbed my arm, shouting at me to snap out of it. Mark barricaded the door to the deck as if that could keep me inside. But they didn't understand. The call wasn't threatening, it was inviting as the assault on our house intensified. I felt a strange calm descend over me. The voice had promised that if I answered its call, if I ventured into the lake voluntarily, the attacks would cease. My friends would be safe. They could return to shore when morning came. Only I was needed, I moved toward the door with a certainty that felt almost like sleepwalking. My friends tried to restrain me, but their hands slipped from my arms as if I were already transformed into something insubstantial. I stepped onto the deck where the fog parted before me, revealing dark water illuminated by an ethereal blue glow from below. Standing at the edge, I looked down to see faces in the water, dozens of them pale and expectant, their eyes reflecting a profound loneliness that resonated with something long buried within me. They had been waiting for someone who could hear them, someone who could serve as bridge between their world and mine behind me. The house had grown quiet. The pounding stopped. The moaning ceased mine. My friends watched through the window, their expressions a mixture of horror and wonder. As I stood poised at the threshold between elements, I understood then what the drowned residents of the lake wanted not to harm, but to be remembered, not to drag me down, but to raise themselves up through my awareness they sought. Acknowledgement of their continued existence in the dark waters of a man-made grave. I knelt at the edge of the deck and placed my hand on the surface of the lake. The water felt warm, almost welcoming, as fingers from below intertwined with mine. Not pulling, but connecting, in that touch, images flooded my mind. Streets and buildings, churches and schools, lives and loves continued in the silence beneath the lake. I didn't need to submerge myself completely. This connection was enough, my recognition of their reality, my willingness to serve as witness to their enduring presence as dawn approached, the pale faces retreated to the depths. But the bond remained. The lake had claimed part of me, just as I now carry part of its secret history. When morning came and the fog lifted, we returned to shore in the suddenly functional motorboat. My friends never spoke of that night again, and we drifted apart in the months that followed. But I returned to Pine Lake every year on the anniversary of our trip, renting the same floating house, waiting for 3:17 a.m., when the residents below rise to share their stories with the only person who chose to listen. I've never told anyone else what I learned that night, how thin the boundary is between worlds, how those we consider gone may simply exist in a different layer of reality. Some might call it haunting, but I've come to understand it as an unusual communion. The lake chose me as its confessor, and I've accepted the role sometimes on ordinary days, far from Pine Lake. I feel the gentle rocking of water beneath my feet, hear distant voices calling my name. The drowned town has extended its boundaries, following me into the world above. I no longer fear its touch, after all. We all live above the surface of greater depths than we can comprehend, treading water in our limited understanding. While ancient truths swirl in the darkness below, the security monitors cast a pale blue glow across my face as I stared at the empty parking garage. The silence was thick enough to choke on. 3 a.m. and 4 more hours to go. 4 more hours of this crushing solitude, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional drip of water from somewhere in the concrete labyrinth below. Something wasn't right tonight. I could feel it in the air, be heavy like the moments before a storm breaks. The cameras showed nothing unusual, yet my skin prickled with a sensation. I couldn't name that corner of the garage on level B3. The one furthest from the exits remained shrouded in shadows that seemed deeper than they should be, darker, almost deliberate. My name is Michael Reeves for 3 years. I've worked night security at Westbrook Mall. One of those sprawling commercial monstrosities with 5 floors of shops, restaurants and entertainment venues. The kind of place that swarms with thousands during the day but transforms into an empty, echoing shell after 10 p.m. My job is simple: make hourly rounds, check the doors, monitor. The cameras report anything suspicious. Nothing ever happens here, or at least nothing ever happened until 3 weeks ago. It started with small things. A car alarm would go off in the middle of the night with no one around. Motion sensor lights would activate despite the cameras showing nothing had triggered them. The usual mall noises, the settling of the building, the hiss of the ventilation system began to sound different, almost purposeful. I told myself I was being paranoid. 3 years of overnight shifts had finally caught up with me. The human mind isn't meant to reverse its natural rhythms indefinitely. But then I saw it, the figure I was watching. The monitors doing my hourly check of all 64 cameras when something moved at the edge of camera 26, the one pointing at that dark corner of B3. A shadow darker than the surrounding darkness slipped between 2 parked cars, a maintenance vehicle and a white sedan belonging to one of the cleaning staff. By the time my brain registered what I was seeing, it was gone blinking. I rewound the footage, but there was nothing there, just empty space between the cars. I made an additional round that night, spending extra time in B3. The air down there felt colder than usual. Not just cool, but cold in a way that seeped through my uniform and settled in my bones. My breath clouded in front of me as I swept my flashlight between the vehicles. Nothing, but as I turned to leave, the overhead lights flickered, and in that millisecond of darkness, I felt something brush past me. A displacement of air, a whisper of fabric, the scent of something ancient and damp, like wet earth and old leaves. That was the beginning. The beginning of my descent into whatever nightmare I'm now living over the next 2 weeks. The incidents escalated. The security cameras would show brief glimpses of a hooded figure in various parts of the garage. Always distant, always obscured, always gone. By the time I reached the location, the mall manager dismissed my concerns, suggesting it was probably just homeless people looking for shelter. Chiuiti reminded me that my job was to remove them, not become obsessed with them. The day security team reported nothing unusual during their shifts. It was just me, always just me. Last Thursday, I decided to focus my rounds on B3, spending most of my shift there. Instead of circling through the entire mall, I set up a folding chair in a dark alcove with a clear view of the corner, where most of the activity seemed to center for 2 hours. Nothing happened. The garage remained silent, aside from the hum of the ventilation system, and the distant sound of traffic from the street above my eyelids grew heavy. The monotony of the night shift exacting its toll. Then the temperature dropped. It happened suddenly, the way it might if someone had opened a freezer door right next to me. My breath immediately formed clouds in front of my face. The fine hairs on my arms and neck stood up, and not just from the cold. The pressure in the air changed like the popping sensation in your ears when driving up a mountain. The overhead lights began to flicker, not all at once, but in a sequential pattern, as if something were moving beneath them, triggering each one as it passed. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time, standing directly under the light at the far end of the row of cars. The hooded figure, tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, and unnaturally still. The hood obscured its face completely, but there was something about the way it stood. Something in the proportions that wasn't right. Its arms hung too low, the fingers too long and jointed in places human fingers shouldn't bend. My heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to break free sweat. Beat on my forehead, despite the cold trickling down my temples and the small of my back. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even blink. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to run, to call for backup, to do something. But my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, trapped in the gaze of something I couldn't even see. Then it moved not toward me, but sideways in a smooth gliding motion that didn't match any human gait I'd ever seen it moved, as if floating inches above the concrete, disappearing behind a concrete pillar. I forced my lean legs to move, stumbling to my feet and fumbling for my flashlight. My hands shook so bad, sadly, I nearly dropped it. By the time I managed to direct the beam toward the pillar, there was nothing there, but in the silence that followed, I heard it, a whispering voice so faint I could barely make out the words, speaking in what sounded like multiple languages at once, overlapping and intertwining among the unintelligible sounds. One phrase repeated clear enough for me to understand. "You see me," I reported nothing to my supervisor. The next morning, what could I say that I was being stalked by some kind of supernatural entity, that I'd heard voices in an empty parking garage? I'd be sent for a psychiatric evaluation faster than I could clean out my locker. Instead, I spent my day off researching the history of the mall, looking for any tragedies or accidents that might explain what I was experiencing. Westbrook Mall stood on land that was once part of an industrial complex in the 1960s, before that historical records showed had been the site of a sanatorium in the early 1900s. Nothing in the records indicated any particular tragedy or reason for hauntings, but the old black and white photographs of the sanatorium sent chills down my spine. Something about the architecture, the high windows and strange angles of the building, reminded me of the proportions of the figure I'd seen. When I returned to work the following night, I came prepared. I brought a digital recorder, a higher quality flashlight, and a personal camera with night vision capabilities, all against mall regulations. But my need for answers outweighed my concern for rules. At this point, the shift started normally. I made my rounds, checked the cameras, filed my hourly reports. Nothing unusual happened until just after 2 a.m. I was in the security office when every monitor went black. Simultaneously, a second later, they flickered back on. But instead of showing their usual feeds, every single screen displayed the same image. The dark corner of B3, and standing there directly facing one of the cameras was the figure. Even through the grainy security footage, I could see now that what I had taken for a hood was actually part of its head, an elongated, misshapen skull that narrowed to a point where a human face should be, where eyes should have been. There were only dark recesses, like deep wells that seemed to absorb the camera's light rather than reflect it. My mouth went dry, my tongue sticking to the roof of my mouth as if glued there. A high-pitched ringing filled my ears, drowning out the usual background noises of the security office. I fumbled for my phone, intending to call someone, anyone, but as my trembling fingers tried to dial, the screens flickered again, and the thing was gone. The monitors returned to their normal feeds as if nothing had happened. I sat there, heart thundering in my chest, for a full 5 minutes before I could move. When I finally stood, my legs nearly gave out beneath me. I should have left, should have walked out of the mall and never come back. But something compelled me toward B3, toward the corner, where the apparition had appeared. It was as if I were being pulled by strings I couldn't see or resist. The elevator ride down felt like descending into my own tomb. Each floor passed with a cheerful ding that seemed obscene in the context of my terror. When the doors slid open on B3, I was hit with a wall of cold air, so intense it burned my lungs. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and flickered, casting stark, shifting shadows across the concrete floor. I stepped out, my footsteps echoing in the cavern of space. The place seemed different, somehow, larger, the ceiling higher. The rows of parked cars stretching farther into the distance than should have been possible, given the actual dimensions of the garage. I moved forward, drawn to that corner like a moth to flame. My flashlight beam cutting through the semi-darkness, catching dust motes that swirled in formations too deliberate to be natural. And then I saw it standing at the end of the row, waiting for me up close. It was worse than I could have imagined. Its body was wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. Limbs too thin and jointed in impossible places, torso elongated and twisted slightly as if viewed through warped glass. But it was the face, or lack thereof, that turned my blood to ice where facial features should have been. There was only smooth, pale skin stretched tightly over a skull that tapered to a point. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Yet somehow I knew it was looking at me. Knew it was aware, my chest constricted, making each breath a painful, conscious effort. Sweat poured down my face despite the freezing air, and my vision narrowed to a tunnel focused solely on the entity before me. I tried to speak, to demand answers, to ask what it wanted from me, but no sound would come. My vocal cords were paralyzed by fear. The thing raised one of its impossibly long arms, elongated fingers unfurling like the petals of some grotesque flower. It pointed not at me, but past me towards something behind my back. Every instinct screamed not to turn around, not to take my eyes off the entity, but my head began to turn of its own accord muscles, moving without my permission that reflected in the window of the parked car. I saw myself, but not as I am now. My reflection showed a gaunt, hollow-eyed version of me, aged beyond recognition, wearing the same security uniform, but weathered and torn, and behind this future version of myself stood rows of similar figures, all with the same vacant expressions, all wearing the same uniform in various states of decay. When I whipped my head back around, the entity was directly in front of me, so close I could feel the cold radiating from it, like waves of negative heat. No breath came from where its mouth should have been, but words formed in my mind, nonetheless clear as if spoken aloud. We were all guards once the implication hit me like a physical blow. These entities, this thing in front of me, had once been people like me, night guards who had seen something they shouldn't have, who had been drawn into whatever twilight realm existed in the forgotten corners of this place. How many before me had stood in this exact spot, facing this exact revelation? How many had become what now stood before me? I stumbled backward, my FI-ORF flight response finally kicking in. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, not toward the elevator, but toward the emergency stairs behind me. I heard a sound like fabric tearing the air itself, splitting open, and felt cold fingers brush the back of my neck. I burst through the stairwell door and took the steps 3 at a time, my lungs burning, legs pumping automatically, driven by pure survival instinct. I didn't stop until I reached my car in the employee lot, fumbling with my keys, hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. A tall, slender silhouette standing just inside the mall entrance, watching me leave. That was 2 days ago. I haven't been back to work, haven't answered my phone when my supervisor called. I've spent the time researching similar experiences, looking for answers or explanations, finding nothing but ghost stories and urban legends. Tomorrow my shift starts at 10 p.m., and I still don't know if I'll go back. Something tells me that if I don't return voluntarily, I'll find myself drawn there anyway. The entities, whatever they are, they've marked me somehow, connected me to whatever exists in that space between reality and somewhere else. And in my darkest moments in the silence of my apartment, when the night is at its deepest, I feel that connection pulling at me. I hear whispers at the edge of my perception, see movement in my peripheral vision, and when I look in the mirror just for a split second before my conscious mind can process it, I see a face that isn't quite mine anymore. Features just slightly elongated eyes, just slightly darker expression, just slightly vacant, I think. Whatever happens, whether I go back tomorrow night or not, I've already started to change, started to become one of them. And the most terrifying part isn't the supernatural entity stalking me or the apparent fate that awaits me. It's the small, quiet part of me that's beginning to accept it, beginning to understand, beginning to want to return after all. We were all guards once. Soon, I will be something else entirely. The first time I noticed something wrong with the mirror was 3 days after I hung it. A flicker in the periphery of my vision, a shadow where no shadow should be. By the time I turned to look directly at it, whatever I'd seen had vanished, leaving only my own reflection, staring back pale and uncertain in the tarnished glass. But even then, something felt wrong about the space behind me, that the mirror showed as if the hallway it reflected was somehow deeper, darker, and not quite the same hallway I stood in. I should have taken it down that very night. Maybe then I'd still be able to sleep without the lights in the mirror. Had arrived 3 weeks ago, part of the modest inheritance from my grandfather's estate. The liverymen had struggled with the weight cursing under their breath as they maneuvered it through my front door, 6 feet tall and nearly 4 feet wide. Its frame was solid wrought iron, blackened with age and worked into intricate patterns that seemed to shift. And why, when viewed too long, the glass itself was old with that slight waviness that distorts the reflection just enough to make it unsettling. At first, I'd been pleased the antique piece added character to my otherwise unremarkable suburban home. I'd hung it at the end of the upstairs hallway, where it reflected the length of the corridor and the staircase beyond. During daylight hours, it brightened the space, bouncing light from the nearby window into what had previously been a gloomy corner. But nights were different. The first week, I attributed the unease to adjustment. New objects in familiar spaces often create this effect. The brain registers something out of place and triggers a low-level alert. I told myself this even as I began to avoid looking directly at the mirror when passing it. After sunset, I developed a habit of keeping my eyes fixed on the opposite wall or the floor, anything to avoid catching sight of whatever moved in that reflected hallway. When I wasn't looking directly at it, the dreams began. On the 9th night, I woke sweating hard, hammering against my ribs. A scream lodged in my throat. I could still feel the sensation of cold, clammy fingers wrapping around my wrist, trying to drag me toward a dark surface that rippled like disturbed water. The pressure had been so real that I checked my skin in the harsh bathroom light, half expecting to find bruises. There were none, but the feeling of those hands lingered. Phantom sensations that made my skin crawl. Sleep became elusive after that. I drift off only to be jolted awake by the same nightmare variations on the theme. Sometimes the hands emerged from underneath my bed. Other times they reached out from the darkness of my closet. But always they sought to pull me towards something reflective, a window, a puddle. The screen of my phone toward the mirror. During the day, I functioned on autopilot. Colleagues asked if I was ill, commenting on the dark circles under my eyes. The slight tremor in my hands as I lifted my coffee cup, I brushed off their concerns with mumbled excuses about insomnia. How could I explain that I was afraid to sleep in my own home because of a mirror? How could I admit that I'd started taking the long way around to the bathroom, using the downstairs facilities rather than pass by that thing in the hallway? Yet despite my fear, or perhaps because of it, I found myself drawn to the mirror. I'd catch myself standing before it, not remembering the journey from my bedroom or home office. Minutes would pass as I stared into its depths, searching for what I'd glimpsed from the corner of my eye. The hallway it showed looked like mine, but subtly wrong. The wall color seemed faded, the woodwork more aged, and sometimes I'd catch a movement at the far end, a dark silhouette that had no business being there in my empty house. After 2 weeks of deteriorating sleep and sanity, I decided to research the mirror's provenance. My grandfather had been a collector of oddities, his house filled with artifacts from his extensive travels. He'd never married after my grandmother's passing and had grown increasingly reclusive in his final years. We hadn't been close. Our relationship consisted of obligatory holiday phone calls and rare visits that always left me unsettled. He'd been a stern, forbidding man with piercing eyes that seemed to look through rather than at you. I started with his personal papers, included in the boxes of belongings the lawyer had sent, along with the mirror. Most were mundane bills, correspondence, old photographs of places I didn't recognize. But in a leather-bound journal dated 30 years earlier, I found the first mention of the mirror. Acquired the Blackwood mirror today. My grandfather had written in his precise hand. The dealer was suspiciously eager to be rid of it, claimed it belonged to the Blackwood estate sale. But I suspect a less reputable source, no matter its remarkable craftsmanship. Regardless of its history, subsequent entries were scattered with references to the mirror. At first, they were merely appreciative notes about its artistic value. Then gradually, they took on a different tone, peculiar effect in the mirror. This evening could swear the reflection showed my study door open when it was firmly closed, and later woke from troubling dreams again. That damnable mirror features prominently. Perhaps I should move it from the bedroom. The final entry about the mirror dated 3 years before his death. Sent through my veins, found Elizabeth's journal from '73. Her account of the mirror matches my experiences exactly as did her father's, before her and his father before him. The pattern is undeniable. Now the mirror has been in the family for 5 generations, and not one has had the courage to destroy it. Including, it seems, myself. The pull is too strong. What waits on the other side must be known. My hands shook as I set down the journal. Elizabeth had been my great aunt, my grandfather's sister. I vaguely remembered her as an eccentric old woman who lived alone in a sprawling Victorian house filled with similar antiquities. Family rumors suggested she'd suffered from mental illness in her later years. Now I wondered if the mirror had been responsible. I needed to know more. I called the only family member who might have answers. My Uncle Robert, my grandfather's younger brother, now in his 70s and living in a retirement community in Arizona, he was reluctant to discuss the mirror. At first, his voice grew strained when I described it, and he asked several times if I was sleeping well. Finally, after I pressed him, the story came out in halting fragments. The mirror had been in the family since the 1880s, brought over from England by my great-great-grandfather. Every generation it passed to a new keeper, always someone who felt inexplicably drawn to it, and every keeper reported the same phenomena: distorted reflections, nightmares, the feeling of being watched, of being called toward the glass. Has anyone ever? I paused, my mouth suddenly dry, heart pounding, gone through it. The long silence that followed told me more than his eventual answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, according to family legend. My great-great-grandfather's brother had vanished without a trace after becoming obsessed with the mirror. Weeks later, family members reported seeing his face in the reflection, watching them, his expression one of silent pleading. Get rid of it, my uncle advised before hanging up. Whatever it shows you, whatever it promises, it's not worth it that night. I stood before the mirror with a hammer in my hand. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to smash the glass to end this torment. But something else, something deeper and more primal, stayed in my hand. I found myself lowering the hammer, stepping closer to the reflective surface in the glass. My reflection did the same, but not quite in sync. There was a delay almost imperceptible, as if the other me was making its own decisions, merely similar to mine and behind that other me. The hallway stretched longer than physically possible, fading into darkness where my actual hallway ended at my bedroom door. My heart raced as sweat beat on my forehead. My legs trembled with the effort to remain standing as a wave of vertigo washed over me. The reflection wavered like heat rising from summer pavement, and for a brief moment I saw what lay beyond, a vast cavernous space dimly lit. With an otherworldly blue light, figures moved in that space, their forms indistinct, but somehow familiar. One turned toward me, and though I couldn't make out features, I knew with bone-deep certainty that it was looking directly at me. I stumbled backward, dropping the hammer with a loud clang that echoed through the house. My reflection didn't move. It stood perfectly still, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite define: hunger, invitation, relief. Then it raised its hand and placed its palm flat against the inside of the glass. Shaking uncontrollably, I retreated to my bedroom and locked the door, pushing a dresser in front of it. For good measure, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, every muscle tense, listening to the silence of the house, a silence occasionally broken by what sounded like fingernails gently tapping on glass, coming from the direction of the hallway. Morning found me exhausted, but resolved I couldn't destroy the mirror. Yet not until I understood what it was, what it wanted. My family had guarded this secret for generations, passing the burden from one to another. Rather than confronting it, I would be different. I would find answers. I spent the day researching obsessively folklore about mirrors, quantum theories about parallel dimensions, occult texts about scrying and portal objects. Most was pseudo-scientific nonsense, but certain elements aligned disturbingly well with my experiences. Mirrors had been considered liminal spaces in many cultures, thresholds between worlds, so some believed they could capture souls or serve as gateways that evening, armed with information, but little actual wisdom. I approached the mirror again. The house felt charged, as if the very air had become electrified. The hair on my arm stood on end as I walked down the hallway, deliberately facing the mirror. Head in my reflection waited, but it wasn't quite me anymore. The face was mine, but the expression belonged to a stranger, knowing to be patient, ancient somehow behind it. The distorted version of my hallway had transformed completely, revealing more of that vast blue-lit space I'd glimpsed before I could see it clearly now. A massive chamber with ceiling and walls lost in shadow, filled with identical mirrors in iron frames, standing in rows like silent sentinels. Each one reflected a different scene, a different room, a different person standing before it. And moving between these mirrors were the silhouette, more distinct now, human shape but wrong, elongated in ways that defied anatomy. Their movements fluid and purposeful. My reflection smiled a terrible, knowing smile I'd never made in my life. It raised its hand to the glass again, inviting me forward, and despite every instinct screaming danger, I found myself mirroring the gesture, my fingertips moving inexorably toward the cool surface. The glass yielded like water cold and viscous against my skin. My reflection's fingers interlaced with mine, its grip surprisingly solid, surprisingly strong. It pulled gently at first, then with increasing pressure. I resisted hard hammering so violently I thought it might burst from my chest. Yet I couldn't quite summon the will to yank my hand away completely. "Who are you?" I gasped, breaking my paralysis. The reply came not in words but in images that flooded my mind. Memories that weren't mine. Lives I hadn't lived, all connected by the mirror, all bearing my face or variations of it. I saw my grandfather standing. Where I stood now, my great aunt, generations of my family stretching back through time, all confronting this same moment of choice. And I understood with sudden horrifying clarity, the mirror didn't contain something trying to get out. It contained versions of myself, alternate selves, from parallel realities, each trapped by their own curiosity, their own inability to walk away, each hoping to trade places with a version still free, with a surge of desperate strength. I tore my hand from the glass. The connection broke with an audible crack, and I fell backward, collapsing against the opposite wall. My reflection remained standing, its expression now one of cold fury. It pounded a fist against its side of the glass, its mouth moving in what looked like screams, though no sound penetrated. The next morning I called a moving company. I couldn't destroy the mirror. Something warned me that breaking it might only weaken whatever barrier separated my world from that blue chamber of horrors, but I could remove it from my home. I had it crated and placed in a storage facility on the outskirts of town. Paying for 5 years in advance, I left strict instructions in my will that upon my death, the unopened crate should be transferred to a blood relative, the strongest willed one I could think of, my cousin's daughter, a hard-nosed federal prosecutor with a reputation for unflinching rationality. I included a letter explaining everything, hoping she would succeed. Where generations of our family had failed, the dreams haven't stopped. Even with the mirror gone every night, I still feel those hands reaching for me. Sometimes I wake to find my fingers pressing against the bedroom window or bathroom mirror, as if trying to push through. And sometimes when I glimpse my reflection unexpectedly in a store window, a puddle after rain, the black screen of my television, I can't shake the fear that the face looking back isn't quite mine anymore. I wonder in my darkest moments if I truly escaped that night, or if some part of me remained trapped on the other side. I wonder if something else came back in my place. Something wearing me like a borrowed coat. Something patient enough to wait for its moment to return to that iron-framed portal. And I wonder if generations from now another descendant will stand before that mirror, feeling the same inexplicable pull, fighting the same battle it fought the mirror. Waits it has all the time in the world. The silence here isn't what you'd expect. It's dense, almost tangible, a living thing that presses against your eardrums until they ache. That's what first struck me about this place. Not the majestic pines or the crisp mountain. AI that travel blogs wax poetic about just that unnatural quiet that makes you strain to hear something, anything that might remind you that you're not alone in the universe. I should have recognized it as a warning. 3 days ago, I arrived at this remote cabin nestled in the forgotten folds of the Appalachians. No cell service, no internet, no distractions, just me. My notebook and the vast emptiness needed to birth my next novel. My agent had been pressuring me for months. "Your readers are waiting," Marcus she'd say with that tight smile that never reached her eyes. "They want to know what darkness you'll plunge them into next." If only she knew the darkness I'd found myself in now. The cabin looked innocent enough upon arrival. Weathered timber walls, a stone chimney, windows with blue shutters that seemed almost cheerful against the somber forest backdrop. The property manager, a gaunt man with eyes that darted everywhere, except directly at me, muttered something about the place being temperamental. I'd laugh, then assuming he meant the ancient plumbing or the finicky wood stove. He didn't laugh back. Instead, he pressed the iron key into my palm with such urgency that his yellow nails left some indentations. "In my skin don't wander too far after dark," he said, already backing toward his truck. These woods get confused at night before I could question what the hell that meant. He was gone, gravel spitting beneath his tires. I spent that first afternoon settling in, arranging my notebooks on the desk by the east window, stocking the small refrigerator with provisions that would last me 2 weeks, and familiarizing myself with the cabin's quirks. Every floorboard seemed to have its own distinct creak, as if the place was learning the weight of me adjusting to my presence. I told myself it was charming that night. I slept deeply exhausted from the drive and the thin mountain air. It wasn't until the second night that I first heard them, sounds that didn't belong. I'd been drifting towards sleep, that delicious lial space, where ideas often crystallize when the first thump rattled the north wall. My eyes snapped open, heart instantly accelerating. I lay still, muscles rigid, listening. Another thump followed, then a slow, deliberate dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the dirt outside. Rationality kicked in an animal. Surely maybe a bear investigating the property. Common enough in these parts, I forced myself to breathe slowly. Count in inhales and exhales until my pulse steadied. Then came the voices. Not conversation, not even words. Just a low murmuring that rose and fell like distant waves. Too coordinated for wildlife, too formless for human speech. The sounds surrounded the cabin, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. At once I sat up, mouth suddenly dry as sandpaper, and reached for the flashlight on my nightstand. The beam cut weakly through the darkness as I aimed it at each window in turn. Nothing visible, yet the murmuring continued, now punctuated by what sounded like my name stretched and distorted, like taffy pulled too thin. Marcus, no. I was imagining it, sleep deprivation, and an overactive writer's imagination, the perfect recipe for auditory hallucinations. I convinced myself of this as I checked the locks and returned to bed, pulling the quilts up. Despite the room not being particularly cold, eventually I drifted into uneasy sleep. Dreams fractured by the sensation of being watched by countless unseen eyes. Morning arrived with merciful normality. Sunlight streamed through the windows, birds called from the surrounding trees, and the events of the night receded like a tide, leaving me questioning if I dreamed the whole episode. Still and under of unease prompted me to investigate the cabin's perimeter after breakfast. The ground surrounding the north wall was undisturbed, no drag marks, no large animal prints. I was simultaneously relieved and disturbed. Relieved because the absence of evidence suggested my mind had indeed been playing tricks on me. Disturbed because the alternative that I was beginning to crack under the pressure of my looming deadline was hardly comforting. Then I saw them on the kitchen window, perfectly formed handprints pressed against the outside of the glass. They were larger than human hands should be, with elongated fingers that tapered to points rather than rounded tips. 5 on each hand, but the proportions were wrong, the thumb too long, the pinky nearly the same length as the middle finger. I approached slowly, my own hand hovering inches away from the glass mirroring, but not touching the print. A chill skittered up my spine like a spider leaving goosebumps in its wake. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps the previous tenant had children who played pranks with mud or paint. Yet the prints didn't look dirty. They appeared as perfect condensation marks if someone with impossibly hot hands had pressed against the cold glass and then vanished. I scrubbed at them with paper towels and dish soap, but they remained stubbornly present, visible only when the light caught the glass at certain angles. That day I tried to write, I truly did, but the cursor blinked accusingly on a blank document, and my handwritten notes seemed suddenly juvenile derivative. The silence of the cabin had transformed overnight, no longer peaceful, but predatory, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Waiting, the wooden walls seemed to contract and expand subtly, like lungs taking shallow breaths. Twice I caught movement from the corner of my eye, only to turn and find empty spaces. The old cuckoo clock in the living room, which hadn't worked since I arrived, began ticking that afternoon. Not the regular heartbeat cadence of a functioning timepiece, but erratic, arrhythmic tick-tick-tick. Silence for 30 seconds tick. I considered removing the batteries before remembering it was wind-powered upon inspection. The mechanism appeared corroded with age, the gears fused with rust, physically incapable of movement. yet it continued its discordant counting by evening. My nerves were frayed. I poured myself 3 fingers of whiskey and tried to convince myself I was simply experiencing the mental toll of isolation. Many writers sought seclusion, and many experienced the psychological quirks that came with removing oneself from regular human contact. This was normal. This was part of the process. The sun set early in the mountains, darkness pooling in the valleys. First, before rising like floodwater, I lit the fire and every lamp in the cabin unwilling to concede. Any corner to shadows each creak and groan of the structure settling made my heart stutter when night fully claimed the forest. It happened again, but worse, the dragging sound returned, circumnavigating the cabin in a deliberate circle, slow, methodical circuits that took exactly 7 minutes to complete. I know because I timed them, watching the glowing digits on my watch with manic focus. 7 minutes pause, 7 minutes again. With each circuit, the sound grew closer, as if whatever made it was spiraling inward toward the cabin. Center toward me, the voices began between the 3rd and 4th circuit. That same murmuring that wasn't quite language, but carried unmistakable intent. My name emerged from the formless sound more frequently now, more clearly. Marcus, see us. Marcus, join us. Marcus, it seeped through the walls like smoke, curling around my consciousness. My body betrayed me with primal fear responses. Pupils dilated so wide my vision swam. Palms slick with cold sweat, heart hammering against my ribs like it might crack them. I retreated to the bathroom, the only room without windows, and sat in the bathtub, fully clothed, flashlight clutched to my chest like a child's teddy bear. The tub was cold porcelain against my back, but I barely registered it through the thundering of blood in my ears. Something scraped at the bathroom door, not knocking, but a deliberate back and forth motion, like a cat asking to be let in, except the sound came from too high up the door for any cat who's there. I finally called out, my voice embarrassingly thin and reed. The scraping stopped instantly. The silence that followed was somehow worse, expectant. Amused, I must have fallen asleep there in the tub, because I woke to daylight filtering under the bathroom door and a body stiff from cold and awkward positioning. Shame washed over me. A grown man, a horror writer, no less is spending the night cowering in a bathtub because of some strange noises and an overactive imagination. I resolved to get a grip on myself. The cabin appeared innocent in the morning light. The cuckoo clock had stopped its phantom ticking. No new handprints decorated the windows. I made coffee and carried it to the porch, determined to reclaim my purpose here. The forest stretched before me, peaceful and indifferent to my nocturnal terrors. But as I sipped the bitter brew, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The ground around the cabin, which should have been covered in fallen pine needles leaves, and the usual forest atrius had been swept clean in a perfect circle, not haphazardly, but with meticulous care, leaving bare earth exactly 20 feet from the cabin walls in every direction, a demarcation line or a ritual boundary. I spent that 3rd day in a fugue state of research, pulling every book from the cabin's small built-in shelves, searching for some clue to what was happening. Most were unremarkable field guides to local flora and fauna, a few dog-eared paperback thrillers, an almanac from 1987, but wedged behind them as if intentionally hidden. I found a slim journal bound in cracking leather. The handwriting inside was spidery and frenetic, dating back 60 years, a previous occupant, a writer like me. I learned documenting increasingly bizarre experiences. The parallels to my own situation made my skin prickle. He, too, described the voices, the handprints, the sensation of the cabin breathing his entries grew more disjointed over time, the handwriting deteriorating into nearly illegible scrolls. The final page contained just one sentence, repeated dozens of times: they were here before us and will remain after. That's when I noticed what I'd been missing from the beginning. The cabin had no mirrors, not one, no bathroom mirror, no decorative mirrors on the walls. Even reflective surfaces like the oven door and refrigerator were matte finished to prevent even the faintest reflection. I knew then that I would not spend another night in this place. I threw my belongings haphazard into my suitcase, leaving behind my notes and half-formed story ideas without a second thought. Whatever inspiration I'd hoped to find here wasn't worth the crawling dread that had taken up residence under my skin as I headed for the door key in hand. The cuckoo clock began ticking again, faster now, like an accelerating pulse. The floorboards groaned under my feet. Though I'd stopped moving, the walls seemed to inhale, racking inward by inches. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that my breath clouded before me. I yanked the door open and froze. The clearing around the cabin was filled with figures. Not people, not animals, but something between, and neither they stood motionless at the boundary where the swept earth met the forest floor. Dozens of them, their forms seeming to waver like heat. Distortion elongated limbs hanging at impossible angles. Where faces should be were swirling voids of deeper darkness. They made no sound yet. I felt the weight of their collective attention, like a physical pressure against my skin. My legs wouldn't move, my lungs refused to expand. I stood paralyzed in the doorway as one figure slowly raised a misshapen hand and beckoned to me with two long fingers. The whispers returned, but I heard them inside my head, now bypassing my ears entirely. Your readers want to know what darkness you'll plunge them into next, they said, using my agent exact words, but stretched and warped. We have such darkness to show you, Marcus. I understood then they'd been calling to me from the moment I arrived, not as prey, but as a collaborator, a conduit, a voice to tell their story. I'd come seeking inspiration, and they were offering it authentic horror that no human mind could conceive alone. The knowledge of what they wanted broke my paralysis. I slammed the door and retreated to the center of the cabin. The walls were definitely closing in now, the ceiling lowering inch by inch. The air grew thick and gelatinous in my lungs. I had two choices: flee into the forest, where those things waited, or remain in the cabin as it constricted around me like a massive throat, preparing to swallow. Neither option promised escape. As the cabin groaned and shifted around me, I made my decision. I would neither run nor be consumed. I took out my notebook, and pen sat cross-legged on the floor, and began to write feverishly. I recorded everything: the voices, the handprints, the breathing house, the watchers in the woods. I poured it all onto the page in a desperate purge. Something changed as I wrote. The constriction of the walls paused. The whispers receded to a curious murmur. I wrote until my hand cramped, until ink stained my fingers, black until sweat soaked through my shirt. Despite the unnatural cold, when I finally looked up, the cabin had returned to its normal dimensions. Outside, the forest was empty of otherworldly figures. The boundary of swept earth remained, but now it seemed protective rather than sinister. I understood the bargain I'd unwittingly struck. They would let me leave, but they had tasted my fear, had fed on it, and now they would live in my words. Every story I wrote from this day forward would carry traces of them. My readers would feel the echo of their whispers between the lines, would glimpse their distorted forms in the white spaces of the page. I finished packing with methodical care, no longer rushing. As I closed the cabin door behind me, I felt the weight of unseen eyes upon me, not threatening now, but expectant. I had become their vessel, their translator to a world that had forgotten. The property manager seemed unsurprised when I returned the key a week early. He didn't ask for explanations, just nodded as if confirming something to himself. They chose you. Then he said, not a question, but a statement of fact. You'll write what they showed you. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The words were already taking shape in my mind, clawing their way toward the page. I drive back toward civilization now, toward deadlines and coffee shops, and the comforting noise of human existence. But I know I brought something back with me from those whispering woods, something that waits behind my eyelids when I blink, something that promises the most terrifying stories I've ever written. If only I'm willing to listen when it calls my name in the deep hours of the night. And God help me, I know I will.